Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Cabbage Head Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Becomes Dragon Weapon. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic.
Izuku was 4 years old. It was a normal day at daycare, and some kids were climbing a tree. "Come on, Aizawa," Kaken called from one of the branches. "Don't be a scaredy cat, and come up here," his best friend said as his hands popped with tiny explosions to emphasize the point. Soon Izuku climbed up and joined them. Kaken was now attempting to stand on the branch, and even though Izuku said that might not be a good idea, he did it anyway. Then he slipped. Several things happened at once.
Kaken fell.
Izuku lunged to catch him and fell as well while trying to do this. Then Izuku wasn't falling anymore, no. He was hovering perfectly in the air and was holding Kaken up by his shirt to make sure he was alright. Izuku slowly descended to the ground and put his friend down before landing himself. "Kaken, are you alright?" Izuku said, frantically looking Kaken over. Kaken just stared at him in shock. "Izuku," he said after a short silence and a blink. Izuku only just noticed that the whole playground went quiet as everyone was staring at him. Izuku thought that maybe something was on his shirt and looked down to find not his normal toddler body, but one of a reptilian-scaled creature, a dragon.
Ah!
Izuku yelped in surprise and fell backwards and found himself changed back into his normal self, and he blinked for a moment before Kaken yelled, "I asked that your Quirk?" "That's so cool," the little boy yelled, and soon everyone gathered around Izuku, including his teachers. Kaken encouraged Izuku to transform again, and Izuku tried thinking of the dragon form he had been in when he caught Kaken from the tree, and then poof, he swiftly transformed into the dragon form. For the rest of the day, Kaken and the other kids were examining Izuku and testing what he could do with his quirk. Breath fire?
Yes.
Super strength? A little more than normal but not super. Fly? Yes, but it was a little tricky. Apart from the basic dragon stuff, Izuku also found some other abilities like being able to change his scales color and camouflage with his surroundings. Izuku also found his senses greatly improved, his sense of smell and taste especially. The end of the day came in a flash, and Izuku ran towards his mom in his dragon form quickly, and then transformed back and told her excitedly about the day he had and all his abilities. At first his mom was puzzled, as there apparently wasn't any sort of dragon quirk on either side of the family. They immediately went to the quirk doctor, and he confirmed that this was a very rare phenomenon where a new quirk will develop entirely. The fact he was able to breathe fire like his father was pure coincidence. Izuku was very excited and happy, as with this kind of quirk, he would be able to be a great hero. Izuku had heard of a new hero with a dragon quirk, and when he got home immediately looked them up to see how they performed with their quirk. Izuku quickly found that they had very different dragon quirks, as she could only transform into a dragon-like form with no extra abilities apart from size and flight, while Izuku had many abilities and could do full dragon transformation. Izuku spent the whole rest of the day on the computer with his mother studying different dragon-like quirks to get an idea how his quirk could work or be used. Izuku was 6 when he was walking home from school one day with his mother, and then the world went black when something hit Izuku over the head, and when Izuku woke up, he was no longer with his mother.
No.
He was in a small dark room. It was completely barren. What is this place? Where's Mom? And many questions similar to this raced through Izuku's head. Shoyuta Aizawa, or Eraserhead, was very, very tired. He didn't want to work today, but he was too much of a workaholic for his own good and started helping with a recent case. Apparently, there was a lead that said of an illegal quirk fighting ring in an old, run-down part of the city. Obviously, it was on the radar because of the whole using quirks against each other, but the more pressing issue with these rings was that the people fighting were very rarely doing it willingly. Half of the time, villains with strong quirks, either taken randomly from the street or gotten from quirk trafficking, were forced to fight, and the other half, it was villains and criminals fighting each other as a punishment. It didn't help matters that these rings were usually the fight-to-the-death kind. Soon the police got the location, and with quite a few heroes and sidekicks joining in for the bust, it seemed that this ring's fighting days was coming to an end soon. Shoyuta, being one of the more experienced heroes, was put at the front of the attack along with Endeavor and Gang Orca. Now, it didn't take much to confirm the location since you could hear the commotion from the outside, and you could see everything from the high-up windows, which also offered an entry point. Police were sent to the front and back doors to arrest anyone who tried to escape, and the heroes positioned themselves on the surrounding roofs. With a simple signal, they dropped in through the windows. Surprisingly enough, it actually wasn't that hard, as the moment the villains saw the number 2 hero, they usually just gave up any hope of getting away. Soon, all the villains, including the ringleaders, were loaded into the armored police cars to be taken to prison. Shoyuta and the rest of the heroes' next task was to find where all of the civilians they were using for the fights were being kept. It didn't take a genius to find the huge multi-floored basement under the warehouse. As expected, most of them were victims of Quirk trafficking, and most were registered in the system under missing, so they could now return to their families safely. After a while, they had most of them cleared it and taken to the station or the hospital if they had any injuries. Shoyuta started to look through the last and deepest level of the basement, but found most of the rooms empty. Not surprising, really, but what was odd was the amount of security precautions that were put on the last room. Endeavor, Gang Orca, and some other heroes promptly joined Shoyuta in checking out the last level. "Why are you just standing here?" Endeavor's annoyed voice asked as Shoyuta was examining the door. "This is bunker-level security on this last door. There must be something really valuable behind it," Shoyuta said, and Endeavor just tisks in annoyance. "Let me open it," Endeavor said and raised his hand. Shoyuta saw what he was about to do and quickly stopped him by using his quirk before the flames could ignite. "Are you crazy?" Shoyuta snapped at him. "What if there's a person behind that door? Or something flammable? You can't just melt through doors with no consideration." Shoyuta yelled at him, and Endeavor just looked away annoyed. "All right then, how do we open it?" he said, not looking Shoyuta in the eye. "We get the police and some professionals, obviously," Shoyuta said, and quickly turned around and left to get the extra help. As Shoyuta was walking away, he heard Endeavor mumble something about it taking too long, but Shoyuta just ignored him. That was a mistake, as a few seconds later there was a bright light and sound of fire coming from behind Shoyuta, and he turned around to see Endeavor had just gone and done it anyway, without consideration. Shoyuta immediately ran back over to him and used his quirk again, extinguishing the flames, but they had already pierced through. Shoyuta looked into the room, and instead of anything he was expecting, like a room full of weapons or maybe a whole other hallway of rooms, instead, he saw a small shape hiding and trembling in the dark corner. There were no lights in the room, so Shoyuta used his phone because, God forbid, he let Endeavor do something again. The sight broke his heart in two. A small, malnourished-looking child, maybe around 7, curled into a small ball in the corner with torn and ripped old clothes. The room itself was small and dirty, definitely no place for a child to be living in. Shoyuta approached them slowly and made sure to shoot Endeavor a glare so he wouldn't approach. The man was too big and intimidating to comfort a crying child. Shoyuta crouched down and spoke softly. "Hello, are you okay?" Shoyuta asked, even though he knew they weren't okay. The small child stiffened, and their sobs stopped before they looked up from their knees where they had buried their face into. Big emerald green eyes stared back at Shoyuta with shock and surprise, then they softened. "Please no. I don't want to go back to fighting," the child said, and Shuta's heart shattered again. They were forcing a young child to fight? These sick BSTRDS. "I'm not gonna make you fight. I'm a pro hero. We are here to save you and take you back home," Shoyuta said gently, and the sobbing stopped quite suddenly. "You're a hero?" the child asked, and Shoyuta nodded with his best reassuring smile. Comforting kids was not his strong suit, but being a teacher definitely gave him some skills with children, even if they weren't quite as young as this kid. "Does this mean I can see my mom again?" the small child asked as they began to uncurl from their balled-up state. "We'll try to get you to your mom," Shoyuta said, and slowly offered his hand. "Come on. We'll take you to the station and see if we can find your mom in the registry." "What's your name?" "I'm Eraserhead," Shoyuta said, and the child quickly took his hand like it was going to disappear if they waited any longer. "I'm Izuku Midoriya said in a small, trembly voice as he stood up. Shoyuta turned around to see that Endeavor thankfully had left and wasn't standing by the door. The last thing Shoyuta wanted was the man to scare the child. They walked down the halls and up the levels. It was quite slow, as Midoriya would hesitate or stop entirely when they saw another hero or police officer looking around, but Shoyuta would give him some reassurance, and they would continue. Finally, they were at the ground floor, and Shoyuta was leading Midoriya outside to be taken for a checkup by one of the paramedics. Now it had been a few hours since the bust, and the sun was starting to rise. Midoriya stopped and looked up at the blues and pinks of the sky. Shuta's heart broke for the third time that day when he saw how excited the kid was over a sunrise. How long had they been down there? Surely not more than a few hours or days, right? This was a death match ring, and kid like this wouldn't last. The paramedics did a quick diagnostic and told Shoyuta they would have to take Midoriya to a hospital since his condition was quite a bit worse than the rest. That's when Shoyuta felt a small tug on his hand and looked down to see Midoriya holding on tightly. "You're gonna leave me?" Midoriya asked. Shuta's heart was not going to make it through any more conversations with this child. Shoyuta was afraid that the kid seemed to trust him more than the paramedics, so Shoyuta just sighed. "No, I'll come with you to the hospital to make sure you're okay." Shoyuta sighed and got into the ambulance with the kid to go to the hospital. Once at the hospital, the doctors also did a quick checkup and left the room Midoriya was in to get some results on his official condition. Midoriya seemed uneasy sitting on the hospital bed. He had been quiet ever since they got to the hospital, but Shoyuta could feel something was wrong. "Is everything all right?"
Shoyuta asked.
Midoriya looked up at him with big green eyes. "Do you know when I can see my mom again?" he asked. Shoyuta shook his head. "We'll get her to come as soon as possible, but before that..." And as if right on K, Detective Tsukachi comes in. "Hello, Eraserhead. This the kid you told me on the phone about," Tsukachi said as he approached Shoyuta. Shoyuta nodded. "All right." Tsukachi sat down and faced a suddenly tense Midoriya. "Hello there, little one. I'm Detective Tsukachi. I'm just going to ask you some questions. It's okay if you don't answer them," Tsukachi said in a calming voice. Midoriya nodded, and Tsukachi took out a pen and paper to write down the answers. "Okay, your name is Izuku Midoriya, right?" Midoriya nodded. "How old are you?" 10. The kid was so small he looked barely 7. "Do you know how long ago you were abducted?" "I was 6. Shoyuta flinched at that one. "He was gone for 4 years. "Were you always at that warehouse, or have you been moved around?" "I was always there." Shoyuta had thought for a second his hearing was betraying him. "Okay, what's your mother's name?" "Inko Midoriya." "Do you have any other family?" "No, it was just me and Mom." "All right, what's your quirk?" Midoriya seemed to hesitate at that one. "It's called Dragon. I can turn into a dragon and have a lot of different abilities," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Tsukachi nodded and stood up. "All right. Thank you for your time, Midoriya. I'll call Eraserhead here when we can get a hold of your mom," he said before leaving. Shoyuta sighed and relented to his fate of staying with the kid until he was reunited with his mom. It was never a good idea to leave a traumatized child alone with strangers. A few hours later, he got a call from Tsukachi. Midoriya was asleep, so he left the room and answered the call in the hallway. "Tsukachi, did you find the kid's mom?" Shoyuta asked, and there was a moment of hesitance from the other end. "Well, there is some bad news." Shoyuta did not like the sound of that. "Well, spit it out." Sleep deprivation was making Shoyuta more annoyed than usual. "We looked up Inko Midoriya and found that she was killed 4 years ago. Apparently, some witnesses said that she was walking home with her son when some shady figures came out of nowhere and hit them both over the head with a metal crowbar. Ms. Midoriya seemed to be hit much harder, though. Before anyone could stop them, the figures took her son and fled," Tsukachi said, and Shoyuta felt his stomach drop into the 5th dimension, never to be seen again. "The kid doesn't know she's dead." Shoyuta thought out loud. "Yes, and since he doesn't have any other family that can care for him, he'll either be put in an orphanage or into the foster care system," Tsukachi said with a carefully blank voice. "Like hell he will," Shoyuta said involuntarily. This kid had been through a terrible ordeal for 4 years. He needed a loving home and family, not to get bounced around in a system of idiots. "What are you suggesting?" Tsukachi said after a brief pause. "I'll be the kid's guardian until further notice. He's already bonded to me," Shoyuta said without thinking. This was irrational. This was so irrational. But Shoyuta didn't care. There was a silence, then Tsukachi responded, "All right. I'll try and help with arranging that paperwork," Tsukachi said with a sigh of relenting to his fate. Then, after a bit more discussion about what the kid needs and about the conditions they found about the ring, Sakachi hung up and Shoyuta went back into the room to see the kid awake. "Did you get the call from the detective? Is my mom coming to pick me up?" Midoriya said with shining eyes, almost bouncing in his seat. Shoyuta didn't know how to reply. He was never good at being the bearer of bad news, so he decided not to reply at all and just looked down at the ground in defeat. It seemed Midoriya realized what that meant, and Shoyuta heard a faint "oh" from the kid. When Shoyuta looked back up, he saw Midoriya was looking down at the ground with a carefully blank expression, but Shoyuta could see the tears starting to form in his eyes. Shoyuta just sat in the seat next to the kid's bed and started to rub the kid's back in a comforting gesture. After a long and deafening silence, Midoriya spoke up. "Where will I live?" Midoriya asked in a small, trembly voice. "Don't worry, kid. I'll take care of you," Shoyuta said without hesitance. Midoriya suddenly looked up at him with complete shock. "What? Really?" he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Yeah, really," Shoyuta said with what he hoped was a reassuring smile. Shoyuta started to panic a bit when the kid suddenly teared up more. "But why? Why would anyone care about a monster like me? Especially a hero," Midoriya said in a shaky voice, and Shoyuta was sure he made the right decision. If this kid had been there for 4 years, then there is no telling about how much he had gone through. The scars on his arms were indication enough of this. "Because you're not a monster. You're a scared child who is put in a situation no one should ever be put in," Shoyuta said as Midoriya quietly sobbed. After a while longer the sobs stopped, and they sat in a much more comfortable silence. Finally the doctor came back and Shoyuta went out into the hallway with him to know the kid's official condition. As expected, Midoriya was severely malnourished. He would need to take vitamins after every meal and shouldn't be given anything too rich or big for at least the first month or so. He also had many bruises and scars, but it seemed like apart from the malnourishment there wasn't anything else that could be life-threatening. The doctor gave Shoyuta the vitamins and told him that all Midoriya needed now was a light meal and some rest, and that he was discharged. Shoyuta sighed and went back into the room, putting the vitamin container in his scarf. Midoriya looked at him with big round eyes and tilted his head a little. "You're discharged. I'll carry you since that bruising must make it hard to walk," Shoyuta said, and Midoriya just nodded weakly. Shoyuta carried Midoriya out the hospital, and again like on Kate, Sakachi's car pulled up. "Thought you might need a ride," was all he said. If Shoyuta didn't know any better then, he would have thought Sakachi had some sort of perfect timing quirk. Shoyuta got in with a shrug and carefully put Midoriya in the seat next to him. The car ride was also quiet, and then they finally arrived at Shuta's apartment building. They bid farewell to Sakachi, and Shoyuta went up to his apartment with the kid who had fallen asleep in the car ride in his arms. Shoyuta put Midoriya carefully on his bed before he started cleaning up his apartment. It was a complete mess. Shura sighed and started making a list of what else needed to be done. He had food at the top of that list and opened his cupboards to find. Yep, this wasn't going to work. It finally hit Shoyuta like a train that he now had a kid, and that he had no idea how basic humaning worked. He concluded that jelly pouches and instant noodles was not going to work, and that he needed to figure out how cooking worked, and also all those other things people did to keep children alive. Shoyuta relented to his fate and took out his phone as he sat on his couch. He opened the group chat where the two most annoyingly energetic people he knew were. "Eternally tired. I may or may not have to learn how to take care of children in like the next 30 minutes or so. Spill the tea. Oh, Shoyuta, what did you do now? Did you kidnap some poor person's child? Eternally tired. More like now have guardianship over a traumatized 10-year-old that spent the last 4 years in a Quirk fighting ring, but essentially yes. Spill the tea. I was being sarcastic. Eternally tired. Well, I'm not, so either help me or leave. Screaming is my day job. Shoulda, why? What did you do? Eternally tired. I got attached to a little lizard that crawled its way into my heart with 3 words. Spill the tea. Well, you know the basics, right? Eternally tired. I don't even know how a proper sleep schedule works. Screaming is my day job. Looks like we have our work cut out for us this time, Namiri. Okay, just make sure they don't die by tomorrow morning. Feed them something. Give them a bath. Sleep before 10, please. Well, come over tomorrow to help with shopping and teaching you how an oven works. Eternally tired. Much appreciated. Shoyuta put his phone down with a tired groan, and then heard a creak, and looked behind him to see Midoriya sticking his head out of his bedroom. "Mr. Eraserhead?" Midoriya called. Shoyuta got up and walked to him. "That's just my hero name. I'm Shoyuta Aizawa," Shoyuta said as he knelt down to the kid's level. "Oh, okay, Mr. Aizawa," Midoriya said shyly. "Alright, come on, kid. Let's get you something to eat," Shoyuta said as he gestured to the thankfully now clean kitchen. "I think I have some cereal, but tomorrow we'll get some better food," Shoyuta said, walking towards the cupboard to find the half-empty box of cereal. "Oh, it's okay, I'll eat anything. You're already being very nice by letting me stay in your home," Midoriya said, and Shoyuta just shook his head while pouring the milk into the cereal. "Nope, while you're here you eat all 3 meals of the day, and they're going to be way better quality than whatever you used to be fed," Shoyuta said in a tone that made it absolute, and Midoriya almost started crying again before wiping the tears away. "Thank you so much," Midoriya said before starting to shovel the cereal into his mouth with the spoon like it was going to disappear if he waited any longer. Soon the cereal was no more, and Shoyuta gave Midoriya the vitamins and some water, which he surprisingly took quickly as well. After taking a bath, where Shoyuta really wanted to strangle whoever was responsible for all the scars on Midoriya, and after learning some other things about Midoriya, like how his favorite food was katsudan and how Midoriya was a very fast learner, he put Midoriya to sleep in his bed and Shoyuta slept on the couch. Shoyuta woke up in the morning when he heard the sounds of something scuttling around in the kitchen. Shoyuta had thought that it might have been that rat that had moved into his apartment, and he added that to his mental list to get rid of that rat. Shoyuta got up and went over to see, instead of a rat, a small green reptile form standing on the counter with its whole upper body in the cupboard looking for something. Its tail swayed back and forth, and once almost threatened to knock a mug off the counter. Shoyuta could also see a pair of wings that threatened to flap open when the small reptile tried to go deeper into the cupboard. Finally, Shoyuta snapped out of his shock when the small dragon decided whatever it was looking for wasn't in the cupboard, and with a click of its claws landed its front feet on the counter, presumably to start searching the other cupboard. Then it froze when it saw the wide-eyed Shoyuta. Immediately, they jumped down to the ground, and in a small puff of smoke there was not longer a dragon but the small boy Midoriya standing there timidly. "I'm sorry," Midoriya said and bowed deeply. "I didn't want to wake you because you seemed so tired, so I tried looking for breakfast myself, and then I got sidetracked when I saw how many jelly pouches you had, and I dash." Midoriya started rambling apologies, and Shoyuta shook his head. "No, don't apologize. You just caught me off guard with that," Shoyuta said while walking towards the small boy. "Was that your quirk?" Shoyuta asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Why, yes. Are you going to throw me out now?" Midoriya asked while looking down at his feet.
What?
"No, of course not. Why would I throw you out because of your quirk?" Shoyuta couldn't help but ask. "Because it's the quirk of a monster. All the mean people used to say that I was a monster and would make a great villain," Midoriya said, obviously trying to hold back tears. Shoyuta shook his head. "Well, they were very wrong and you shouldn't listen to them." Shoyuta knelt down to Midoriya's level. "Tell me, what do you want to be when you grow up?" Shoyuta asked, dead serious. I want to be a hero," Midoriya said nervously, and held the rim of his old shirt in his hand. Shoyuta really needed to get this kid new clothes. "Well, you have a great quirk to become a hero with. Do you know the hero Ryukyu?" Shoyuta asked, and Midoriya nodded weakly. "Yes, she was the first hero I looked up when I first got my quirk," Midoriya said, and he wiped the tears away from his eyes. "Then you should know how great your kind of quirk is for heroics, and I'm a pro already, so I can train you if you're really serious," Shoyuta said. Midoriya's eyes lit up as he looked up and made eye contact with Shoyuta. "Really? You would train me?" he said with so much disbelief it hurt Shuta's soul. "Yes, if you are really sure, then yes, I will train you," Midoriya, Shoyuta said, and Midoriya flinched a little. "You can call me Izuku. You don't have to use my family name," Izuku said quietly, and Shoyuta nodded. After that, Shoyuta poured another bowl of cereal, and he himself had some instant noodles, which Izuku looked at like they were made of gold, but didn't say anything as he ate his cereal. Then the doorbell rung as Izuku had just swallowed his vitamins, and Shoyuta went to answer it. Shoyuta knew who it was going to be, and opened the door slightly and glared at Hisashi and Namiri with a silent threat of, "If you shout, you're dead." They both nodded eagerly and Shoyuta opened the door all the way. Izuku had now stood up and left his chair and was looking at Shoyuta from where he stood with curiosity burning in his gaze. Izuku, this is Hisashi Yamada and Namuri Kiyama, two friends of mine. Guys, this is Izuku Midoriya, Shoyuta introduced them. Izuku gave a shy wave and Namuri and Hisashi immediately started cooing over the cute little green child in front of them. Oh my god. No wonder you managed to crawl into Shuta's heart. You're so cute, Hisashi said, and Namuri said something similar at the same time. Izuku immediately shrunk away a little and Shoyuta shot the two a glare and used his quirk since it usually made him look scarier. Shoyuta did not expect what happened next to happen. I asked that your quirk. Shoyuta heard Izuku yell and Shoyuta blinked, letting his quirk go, and turned to the previously timid child, who was now an ecstatic ball of energy out of nowhere. What kind of quirk is that? What does it do? What's it called? Why does your hair fly up when you use it? Izuku fired a barrage of questions that left Shoyuta dazed, and the other two also surprised. Oh, dash. Sorry, I started rambling again, didn't I? Sorry, I just really like quirks, but with everything that happened, I never got a chance to ask you about your quirk until now. Izuku deflated back into his timid state, and Shoyuta just buried the smile he had into his capture weapon. Oh, well, you don't have to apologize, Midoriya. You were just curious, Namuri said as she knelt down to be face-to-face with Izuku.
Oh.
You can call me Izuku. Izuku said to Namuri and Hisashi. Well, you can call me Uncle Zashi, Hisashi announced dramatically. Yeah, and you can call me Auntie Mori, Namuri announced just as dramatically. Shoyuta was going to say something but stopped when he saw the huge grin on Izuku's face. Okay, Izuku said happily, and Shuta's heart melted at the sight. Soon Hisashi and Namuri were sitting on the couch talking eagerly with Izuku about all assortment of things, and eventually Shoyuta was dragged into the conversation when Izuku asked about his quirk again. He explained his quirk erasure. So, if you look at someone they can't use their quirk anymore until you look away or blink. Izuku asked and Shoyuta confirmed it with a nod.
Oh.
Well, if you look in the mirror while using your quirk, what would happen? Izuku asked, and Shoyuta had never really thought of that. I don't know. I'll try that out later. But first, now that the two idiots are here, Shoyuta said, but was cut off by Hisashi. We're going shopping for you, little listener, Hisashi announced somehow even more dramatically, if that was possible. Izuku had stars in his eyes. Shopping? For Dash. For me? Izuku asked hesitantly, and everyone nodded in unison. Then Izuku started tearing up and Namuri and Hisashi started panicking. You're all so nice. I don't deserve any of this. Thank you, Izuku said. He was wiping his tears away. Oh kid, of course you deserve it, Namuri tried to encourage. Yeah. You deserve the best, little listener. Hisashi joined in, and Shoyuta nodded along. At least these two idiots were good with kids. Alright, come on. I don't want to see you wearing those old clothes by the end of the day, and well, also try to get you your own bed that'll go in the extra room. Shoyuta said while standing up, and Izuku nodded as he got up from the couch with Hisashi and Namuri in tow. The clothes shopping was soon completed as Namuri dragged them to every clothes store through the mall, and Izuku got to change into a plain green shirt and red shorts with red shoes he liked. When it came to toys and that sort of things, they were surprised to find that Izuku didn't really like toys much apart from stuffed animals, and he more gravitated to books. So after spending time and money at the bookstore with Hisashi, helping there, and also getting a few plushies for Izuku that he had liked, they headed to the food court for lunch. Hisashi and Namuri attempted to drag Shoyuta and Izuku to some fast food joint, but Shoyuta didn't budge, as that wasn't the kind of food someone recovering from malnourishment like Izuku needed. So in the end, Shoyuta took them to a more quiet coffee shop with actually healthy options that fit well with what Izuku was allowed to eat. After eating and Hisashi and Namuri revealing that they were also pro-heroes, to the amazement of Izuku, they headed to get Izuku a bed, and Shoyuta took the lead here. They walked around a bit before Izuku settled on a pretty generic normal bed, but it must have seemed like luxury to Izuku. Izuku picked some black sheets with red stripes, which was not what they were expecting of the child who had only really shown a love for green, but they rolled with it, and by the end of the day had everything they needed, including some decorations Izuku had picked out, and paint for the walls, which clued Shoyuta into the fact he would be sleeping on the couch for the next little bit. After this, they headed back to Shuta's apartment. Namuri started to flick through the channels until Izuku stopped her on a news station that was reporting an ongoing hero and villain fight. Izuku took out his newly bought notebook and started jotting down notes on the hero. Hisashi was busy trying to teach Shoyuta how basically everything that was in the microwave in the kitchen worked, and also how to cook some basic meals that fit with what Izuku was allowed to eat. At 8 p.m., they had a relatively decent dinner with the groceries they also bought while out. Just some basic chicken and rice. After dinner, Shoyuta was cleaning the dishes when he heard Hisashi the fool ask a question he was hoping wouldn't come up. "Hey, Izuku, what's your quirk?" The whole room went silent as Izuku, who had been chatting with Namuri about the fight they saw on TV, was now dead quiet.
Well,
It's called dragon. I can turn into a dragon and do anything a dragon could do and more. Izuku said quietly and timidly. Really? That sounds like a cool quirk to have. I thought you might have had an analyzing quirk for a second. Namuri said, completely oblivious to how uncomfortable they were making Izuku, and Shoyuta decided to jump in. Alright, it's getting late, and Izuku needs to head off to bed in a bit. You two should probably be on your way since you have classes in the morning, Shoyuta said while glaring at the two idiots. Hisashi and Namuri exchanged a confused glance but nodded, and Shoyuta ushered them towards the door. Before Shoyuta could slam the door in their faces, Hisashi stopped him. Why do we have to go all of a sudden? I know there is another reason apart from the time, Hisashi asked, and Shoyuta sighed. You started asking him about his quirk, and I don't know if I have to remind you idiots, but he was in a quirk fighting ring. Because of that, he seems very uncomfortable about his quirk, and even called it a monster's quirk this morning before you arrived. Namuri and Hisashi both looked down sadly and full of guilt. That kid seems love all quirks. He must have really had a bad time if they made him hate his own quirk like that. Hisashi said, and Shoyuta only nodded before saying goodbye and closing the door. When Shoyuta turned around, Izuku was looking at the floor sadly, and Shoyuta just wordlessly went up and hugged him. The kids soon hugged him back, and they stayed like that for a bit before Shoyuta stood up and told Izuku to go take a quick shower before getting into his new pajamas which they had bought, and Izuku wordlessly complied. Soon Izuku was sleeping soundly in Shuta's bed, and Shoyuta just sighed before setting an alarm on his phone and crashing onto the couch for some much-needed sleep. Shoyuta was awoken by his alarm and started working on a pretty basic breakfast of toast and eggs. After Shoyuta finished, he went over to his room and opened the door to find a small green dragon curled up on his bed and all the sheets seemingly forming some sort of nest around it. The small dragon's ears perked up when the door creaked, and he raised his head. The moment he saw Shoyuta, Izuku poofed back into his normal form. Sorry. I transform when I sleep, Izuku said, and Shoyuta just put his hand up. Don't apologize for something you can't help. It's fine. Come on. Breakfast is ready, Shoyuta said before leaving the room, and he heard the small pitter-patter of feet behind him. They had a silent breakfast, and when Izuku finished, he looked up at Shoyuta. Hey, Mr. Aizawa. Are there any parks or grassy areas around here? Izuku asked, and Shoyuta thought for a second. Yeah, there is a park a few blocks away. It's not very big, but it's very nice. Do you want to go? Shoyuta asked, and Izuku nodded. Shoyuta smiled as he stood up to get ready. All right. You should go change into one of your new outfits then. Oh? And you can call me Shoyuta, Shoyuta said, and Izuku nodded before running off to go change. Shoyuta also got ready, and they soon left for the park. Izuku seemed completely amazed by the lush green park. There were other children also playing around, and that reminded Shoyuta how he needed to get Izuku enrolled at the local elementary school. Shoyuta sat down on a bench and urged Izuku to go do whatever he wanted to come here to do. At first, Shoyuta thought Izuku wanted to come to try and socialize with other kids his age, but that was quickly proven wrong as Izuku was actively avoiding the other kids and mostly playing around on his own. Izuku was definitely an energetic child, and he hid that well under a layer of timidness, but now Shoyuta could see that energy being used. Izuku was running around like crazy and stopped every once in a while to examine the ground and plants before continuing on with what he was doing. At one point, Izuku climbed up a tree, but before Shoyuta could go over to make sure it didn't fall, Izuku just gave him a thumbs up and an expression that told Shoyuta he knew what he was doing, and it seemed that was true as Izuku climbed the tree like it was second nature for him. Some other children had noticed the newcomer and had tried to approach him, and now seemed to be when they were the most interested as they saw how easily Izuku climbed the tree. Shoyuta wasn't too far off, so he heard the conversation that commenced.
Wow.
How did you climb that so quickly? One kid with multiple eyes asked.
Oh.
Well, I used to climb trees a lot, so it's kind of second nature, I guess. Izuku said from his spot on a branch. Izuku seemed much more at ease outside, which Shoyuta took note of. Do you think you can show me how to climb? A girl with long pink hair asked. Well, it's not exactly safe. You would need to ask your parents first, Izuku said. Shoyuta did a small nod in agreement. Izuku seemed quite responsible and smart, Shoyuta had noticed. Considering where he was for 4 years of his life, with most likely no education, Izuku had a very wide vocabulary.
Ah. All right.
The girl yelled, and soon the small crowd of children dispersed to go find their parents. Izuku stayed up on the branch, swinging his feet back and forth, seemingly enjoying the view. Izuku felt very at ease in nature. He always had ever since he was little, which was why it pained him so much to have stayed in that dark room for so long. Izuku just enjoyed the view as he looked around, scanning the park. He saw Shoyuta sitting off in the distance and waved at him happily with a huge grin on his face. It seemed most of the children had been told no by their parents. Izuku was jolted out of his thoughts when one of the kids from earlier came back. It wasn't one of the two who had spoken, but one of the ones who had simply watched. She had yellow eyes and blonde hair in 2 messy buns. Hey, my parents said I could if I was careful, she called, and Izuku smiled as he quickly climbed down. It would have been faster to transform and just glide down, but Izuku didn't want to scare them away. Okay, so what do you know about climbing? Izuku asked, and the girl just shrugged. Now that Izuku was on the same ground as her, he realized she was probably a bit older than him, but not by much. Maybe 1 or 2 years older. Well, everyone looked older than Izuku, he had come to realize, but she was definitely older. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Find a good foothold and dash. Izuku spent the next little while teaching this girl how to climb, and some other kids were also listening but weren't attempting it. Soon the girl and Izuku sat next to each other on the tree branch. Wow, you can see everything from up here, she said, and Izuku smiled at her excitement. A wide, genuine smile that showed his teeth unwillingly. The girl stopped and stared at Izuku for a second at seeing that you have fangs, she said, and Izuku stopped smiling immediately at that comment. Izuku had some minor mutations from his quirk that he could mostly get rid of, but he could never get rid of the 2 small but sharp fangs that were in his mouth even in his human form. Izuku had become good at hiding it subconsciously, but he must have been having so much fun that, just like mine. So cool. I've never met someone with fangs like mine, the girl said, pointing to 2 pointy fangs as she smiled, and that cut Izuku's bad train of thought immediately. You're not scared of them? He asked, surprised. Why would I be scared? They look cool. Oh, I just realized that I never introduced myself. I'm Himiko Toga. You can call me Himiko. What's your name? Himiko asked. Oh, I'm Izuku dash. Izuku stopped there. For some reason, it didn't feel right introducing himself with his family name. Izuku what? Himiko tilted her head. Just Izuku. Izuku said quietly. Well, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for teaching me how to climb a tree. You should be a teacher, you know. Himiko said excitedly. Oh, well, I don't think I would have the confidence. Izuku said shyly. Well, that's all right. Anyway, do you live around here? I live nearby with my family, Himiko said, and made hand gestures to emphasize this. Oh, I live a few blocks away with my dad, Izuku said, and almost did a double take at that but didn't correct himself because it just felt right to call him that. Then a familiar voice cut through the excitement. Izuku. Izuku looked down to see Shoyuta standing under the tree. We should be heading home for lunch, Shoyuta said, and Izuku nodded, climbed down, and helped Himiko climb down. Bye, Himiko. I have to go, he said with a little wave, and started to leave with Shoyuta. Himiko waved him away as well. When they got back home, Izuku sat down and continued on finishing his notes about Uncle Zashi or Present Mike and Auntie Mori or Midnight. Then Shoyuta called from the kitchen. Seems you made a new friend today. Wanna go back tomorrow? Shoyuta asked. Yes, please, Izuku said as he finished up the notes. For the next 3 days, Izuku would go to the park after breakfast and play with Himiko until lunch. It was fun and took Izuku's mind off of other things. Then Monday came, and Shoyuta told Izuku that today he couldn't go see Himiko. What? Why? Did I do something wrong? Is this a punishment for something? Izuku asked desperately, trying to find out why he couldn't hang out with his friend. Oh, no, nothing like that. It's just that today is your first day of school, Shoyuta said casually, and Izuku froze. School? Izuku said in complete shock. Yes. You did go to school before everything when you were right? Shoyuta looked up from his food, and Izuku beamed a bright smile. Yes, of course I used to go to school. I just can't believe I get to go again. I'm so excited. Oh, I haven't gone in so long. Do you think I'll be behind? Izuku was now panicking at the prospect of being in a class full of children younger than him. Shoyuta just shook his head. No. Surprisingly, you're up to the standards for your age, or even higher if your vocabulary and how many books you read is any indication. If you're behind in anything, I have no doubt you'd catch up quickly, and don't be afraid to ask me for help. I'm a teacher at a high school, you know, Shoyuta said, and Izuku dropped back into his seat that he had been standing on. Okay, when does it start? Izuku asked. In about an hour. I'll drive you there and drop you off. I'll pick you up at the end of the school day as well, Shoyuta said, and Izuku nodded. He quickly ate his breakfast and went into the room which had been the extra room transformed into his bedroom over the last 3 days thanks to Zashi and Mori. Izuku quickly changed, and when he poked his head out of his room, Shoyuta gave him a backpack with all the books and supplies he would need. Izuku also put his now half-filled notebook inside and sat on the couch for the rest of the time before Shoyuta said it was time to go. Izuku was basically buzzing with anticipation in the car and happily skipped into the school when they arrived. Unsurprisingly, Izuku got lost in the surprisingly big elementary school, but a teacher found him and led him to his class. Izuku was actually very lucky that the school year was just starting and that he didn't get put into a class in the middle of the semester. Izuku sat down near the front next to the windows, and other kids were also arriving. The bell rang, and Izuku got déjà vu remembering when he was in first grade. Soon the teacher came in and started. She had them each come up to the front one by one and give their names and quirks. Izuku was paying so much attention to all the new quirks he was hearing about that he barely noticed when the teacher called him up. Izuku timidly walked up and introduced himself. Hi, I'm Izuku Midoriya. Izuku couldn't get out of saying his full name for this. The teacher urged him to say about his quirk when he tried to leave immediately, hoping no one would notice he didn't say his quirk. Izuku sighed and relented to his fate. My quirk is sea-called dragon. I can turn into a dragon and have a bunch of different abilities. Izuku was trying to get his shaking under control as all eyes were on him. The moment the last word left Izuku's mouth, he bolted for his seat. Izuku listened to all the quirks half-heartedly after that, since he was sure his class would alienate him now. After the introduction, it was a basic mathematics class, which Izuku didn't really find interesting because it was so easy and he didn't raise his hand, so he wouldn't draw any more attention to himself. Finally, the bell rung for break, and Izuku tried to gather his things as quickly as possible, but was stopped when a group of kids that was a good chunk of the class approached him. Izuku resigned himself to his fate of being bullied, but surprisingly that didn't happen. Hey there, new kid. You weren't in our class last year. A girl with short black hair said to him, and Izuku just weakly nodded. Hey, don't try and take the main stage. I want to talk to Dragon Kid too. A boy with dark gray hair that covered most of his face said. Well, anyway, you got a pretty cool quirk. Really, I wouldn't be surprised if you became a hero. The girl said with a huge smile. What was this? Why weren't they bullying him? They weren't calling him a monster or villain. A hero? Soon more words similar to that came from the large group, and Izuku was getting dizzy, unable to focus on one voice. Then out of the corner of Izuku's eye, he saw a purple-haired kid quietly take out his lunch and seemed to be getting ready to leave. Izuku remembered that kid as being one of the ones he took special note on. Brainwashing was his quirk? Izuku sidestepped the crowd and started heading towards the purple-haired boy, but the black-haired girl swiftly stopped him. Hey, don't approach that guy. He had a brainwashing quirk, you know. He's definitely going to be a villain, the girl said, and there were various nods and words of agreement. Izuku shook his head. Well, I think it's a great quirk, and if anything, that would be a good quirk for a heroics. It's practical. You shouldn't judge someone right out the gate based on their quirk. You judge them based on their actions, was what Izuku said before he bypasted the girl and walked up to the boy. Hi. Shinso, right? Izuku said, recalling his memory from when the boy was introducing himself. Shinso looked up and nodded slightly. Why are you here? Gonna try and pick on me? Shinso said with an annoyed expression.
What? No.
I was just wondering if you wanted to eat together? Izuku asked. Is this some trick? Case that's a new one, Shinso said, standing up. What? No. Izuku shook his head. I'm really asking. All those other kids were acting mean towards you, and I'm not the kind of person to just go with herd instinct on something I know nothing about, Izuku said, trying to sound as sincere as possible. Shinso shrugged. Do what you want, Shinso said, and Izuku followed him out the class and to a bench at the side of the school. After a long silence, where Izuku was just nervously eating his food, Shinso finally spoke up. You know about my quirk, right? Shinso asked. Well, yes. Of course, Izuku said, glad to finally have something to break silence. Then why are you trying to hang out with me? Don't you know I have a villainous quirk? Shinso said with a bitterness Izuku recognized. Well, first off, there is no such thing as a villainous quirk. Shinso turned and looked at Izuku. Surprise, sure, your quirk could be used to do bad, but can't most quirks? You need to focus on the good it could do, like taking villains down instantly. You could be a great hero. That is if you want to be a hero. Izuku said encouragingly. Well, yes, I do. But how can you know? You were born with such a strong and perfect quirk to stand out and be loved, Shinso said, and Izuku flinched. Well, like I said in class, you judge a person on their actions, not their quirk, and if anything, I'm the most villainous person here. Izuku said, looking away nervously.
Why?
You seem so nice. Why would you be a villain? Shinso asked in disbelief, and Izuku just nudged himself away. I don't like to talk about it, Izuku said, and stood up. I'm sorry for bothering you. I'll just leave before I cause any more trouble. Izuku started to leave, but Shinso called out for him to wait, which only made Izuku start running, and Izuku didn't even stop when people started giving him weird stares. If anything, that made him run faster. Soon Izuku found himself hiding in a bathroom stall. He didn't even remember making the decision to come to the bathroom specifically. He just needed a place to breathe. Izuku's arm itched. Actually, everything itched. Every place there was a scar or had been a healed bruise, Izuku felt the need to itch at, to get rid of any remnants, but Izuku couldn't escape what had happened, what he'd done. Izuku started hyperventilating. Izuku needed to calm himself. He was fine, everything was fine. But it wasn't. Izuku tried to hold back sobs.
He couldn't sob.
He wasn't allowed to. They would hear him and hurt him. He couldn't. He was helpless. He was nothing but a monster. Flashes from the fighting played in Izuku's mind over and over. The blood, oh God, there was so much blood. Screams that were cut short just like their lives. The cheers of the villains watching. Izuku couldn't force it out. It was like a thick fog suffocating him. The bell rung, but Izuku couldn't hear it over his own ragged and shallow breaths that he couldn't get enough oxygen out of. Then there was a hand on Izuku's shoulder. Izuku flinched and just waited. He waited for someone to hit him for him being disobedient and crying like a child, but it never came. Someone was talking slow and soft and repetitively. Izuku couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was calming, and Izuku's breathing started to even out after what felt like an eternity. Finally, Izuku managed to open his eyes. When had he closed them? Izuku looked up through tear-filled vision to see who was speaking and put their hand on his shoulder. It was Shinso. Breath in and out. In and out, Shinso was saying calmly, and then he saw Izuku had opened his eyes. Are you alright? You just ran off, and when I found you it looked like you were having a panic attack or an episode or something, Shinso said, still keeping his voice calm, but Izuku could hear the worry. Izuku wiped the tears from his eyes and slowly stood up. Luckily, Izuku had managed not to itch any of his scars, which would have been bad since Izuku knew once he started there wasn't any stopping until someone either restrained him or he passed out. Izuku walked to the sink without a word and splashed some water on his face. "Did the bell ring?" he asked, and Shinso nodded. Sorry for making you late to class." Izuku apologized in a small, trembly voice. Shinso approached him and put his hand on his shoulder again. "It's fine, but what was that?" Shinso asked. Izuku shook his head. "It was nothing. Just a stupid thing that happens sometimes when I get upset over things I can't change," Izuku said in frustration. He was doing so well, and yet he had to go ruin his first day of school and drag another kid into his problems. He really is a villain. "What? That wasn't nothing. You were having a panic attack on the floor. Look, I don't know what happened or why you were like that, but you shouldn't underestimate your own problems," Shinso protested, and then there was a heavy silence. Malice suddenly cut through the air as Izuku spoke. "Yeah, you don't know what happened because if you did," Izuku started to walk away to the bathroom exit. "You wouldn't be talking to me right now." It was only then that Izuku noticed some scales creeping up his hand. He must have partially transformed without realizing it. Izuku shook his hand, and the scales retreated as he exited the bathroom. Izuku didn't go back to class. He knew he left his bag there, but he would have to get it later. Izuku went outside to the school courtyard and just sat down in the shade of the building. He looked up at the clouds passing by in the sky. So free and limitless.
Izuku used to be like that.
Why did everything have to happen? Izuku's life was perfect. He had friends, a loving mother, an amazing Quirk, and a bright future. Then it was all thrown out the window. Izuku sighed and let his thoughts carry him away. Before he knew it, he had fallen asleep. The bell rang for second break, and that woke Izuku up. He yawned and stretched before getting up and heading to the class so he could put his lunchbox away in his bag. He carefully waited around the corner for the class to clear out before entering. He didn't need anyone asking him where he had been. Of course, it seemed this ended up being futile, as when Izuku walked in he saw Shinso sitting in his seat, and Izuku was very tempted to turn around and walk away, but he just kept walking and walked past Shinso to his seat where his bag was, and he put his lunchbox away. Izuku turned around to see Shinso looking at him with concern. "I won't push you to tell me anything," Shinso said as he stood up, "but hey, you're the one that wanted to hang out in the first place, right?" Shinso asked, and Izuku could feel a tired smile creep onto his face. The rest of the break was spent with Izuku and Shinso getting to know each other. Finally, school ended after 2 more boring classes, and Izuku was happy to be able to go home and just relax watching the hero news while Shoyuta made lunch. But it seemed life had other plans, and Izuku wasn't out of the woods yet. Izuku got into the car and Shoyuta drove away, but Izuku noticed that they weren't driving into the usual area of their apartment block. "Hey, Shoyuta, where are we going? This doesn't look like the streets around the apartment," Izuku asked. "Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you this morning. Today is also my first day back. I've already done all my morning classes, but I need to head back for some paperwork. You don't mind, do you?" Shoyuta asked, and Izuku shook his head. "No, I don't mind." "Oh yeah, you never told me where you worked as a teacher. Since you're a pro, I'd assume it's a hero school?" Izuku asked, and Shoyuta seemed to nod. "Yep, UA," Shoyuta said casually, like he hadn't just dropped a bombshell on Izuku's head. Izuku choked on air. He didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything at all. Eventually they stopped, and Izuku looked out the window at the outer walls of UA's barrier. "Here," Shoyuta said, and handed him a guest pass card as he got out. "Wait, I'm going in too? I thought I'd just wait in the car or something," Izuku protested. Shoyuta just shook his head. "It's not exactly safe to leave a traumatized child in a car, and anyway, I won't be leaving you alone at home when I need to do or get paperwork like this. I'll be picking you up from school and then drive back to UA, so you should at least get familiar with the campus or at least the way to the teacher's lounge," Shoyuta explained, and Izuku could only nod absent-mindedly as he also got out the car and took the guest pass. Izuku followed Shoyuta into the school, and some of the exiting students gave a glance at the strange child following a tired hobo-looking man, but when the gate didn't go off they just shrugged and kept walking. Izuku was in complete awe but tried as hard as possible to memorize the way to the teacher's lounge as he followed Shoyuta there. Something Izuku was not expecting was when he entered the teacher's lounge to also see Uncle Zashi and Annie Mori sitting doing paperwork as well. They both immediately came over and started cooing over him, and how they were excited he would start coming to UA, and all Izuku could think was that he did not deserve this. What merciful God had given Izuku this as his new life? He deserved to be cast away like a villain, not to be standing in UA halls with a supportive and loving, well, family. Izuku was sat on the couch waiting for Shoyuta to finish up some paperwork that he couldn't do at home. He was talking with Zashi about his hero notes and was also berating Zashi on the amount of hair gel he used that was unhealthy for his hair, but Zashi just nervously laughed it away. Then the door slid open and a small animal thing came through. Izuku wasn't sure if it was a dog or a bear or a mouse, but he was sure of who it was. Izuku quickly looked through his notes to find a page which had "still in progress" at the bottom in pencil. Netsu, the principal of UA High, and the smartest being on the planet thanks to his quirk high specs. Netsu without hesitation started walking towards Izuku. Izuku was stunned to say the least.
Ah,
You must be Izuku Midoriya. I've heard much about you from Present Mike and Midnight. I'm Netsu. Am I a dog or a bear or a mouse? What matters is that I'm the principal of UA. Netsu announced, and Izuku had a face of pure astonishment before he spoke. Your quirk is high specs, right? Izuku asked, and Netsu nodded. In an instant, Izuku had jumped off the couch and started asking Netsu questions about his quirk and his intellect. Netsu happily complied and started answering them, and Izuku wrote every answer down in his notebook. Eventually, the conversation branched into other areas. They talked and talked for what seemed like forever. At some point, Netsu had made tea, but Izuku wasn't sure when. Finally, Shoyuta came up to them at one point. Sorry to cut your conversation, but Izuku and I need to get going home, Shoyuta said, holding a few papers in his hand. Izuku nodded and bid Netsu a farewell and left with Shoyuta. Izuku went home, started and quickly finished his homework when suddenly Shoyuta asks him something. Oh, yeah, and forgot to ask, how was your first day at school, Izuku? Izuku went quiet for a moment before he just shook his head clear of any bad thoughts. He couldn't let Shoyuta start worrying over nothing. It was good. Yep, a good day, Izuku said, also trying to convince himself. Shoyuta saw right through the lie, though. Something happened? Shoyuta asked. Izuku shook his head. Nothing, I just overreacted over something. Izuku tried reassuring, but Shoyuta didn't seem to be buying it. Izuku, you know that you have to be honest with me and yourself if you want to get better. Please tell me what happened, Shoyuta said, and Izuku sighed. I had a panic attack and started thinking back to when I was fighting, Izuku admitted, and Shoyuta patted his head. Thank you for telling me. What triggered this? Do you think you won't be able to go to that school anymore? Shoyuta asked, and Izuku shook his head frantically.
no.
Nothing with the school itself. I just had a conversation with someone that wasn't the most pleasant, Izuku admitted. Do you think this person will cause you any trouble in the future? Shoyuta asked, and Izuku once again shook his head. No. They're nice. It was just a bad first impression, that's all, Izuku insisted, and finally Shoyuta dropped it.
All right.
Anyway, do you want to go to the park to see if your friend's there? Shoyuta asked, and Izuku immediately brightened up. They headed to the park, and soon Izuku saw Himiko running towards him while waving. Hey, Izuku, she yelled as she ran towards him. Oh, Himiko. I just had my first day of school, Izuku said proudly, and they went over to the tree they always climbed to talk. Izuku talked about all the boring classes, and Himiko talked about her classmates and how she made friends with a bunny girl. Izuku decided not to mention Yue, but he did mention Shinso, and how Izuku was thinking that maybe he was going to be his friend. They played and talked, and after a while the sun had started to go down. Himiko waved Izuku goodbye since she had to be home before dark, and Izuku left back to the apartment with Shoyuta. Izuku had dinner, took a shower, changed into his pajamas, and then went into his room with light green painted walls to read some books before he slept. At one point, Shoyuta popped his head in through the door. You alright, kid? Izuku nodded, still focused on his book. You've been settling in okay the last few days? Shoyuta asked, and this time Izuku looked up. Thank you. Thank you so much for all of this, Izuku said with a beaming smile. Shoyuta smiled back, even if he tried to hide it in his scarf. Okay, kid, get some sleep. You have school in the morning, Shoyuta said, and Izuku nodded and closed his book. Izuku was really happy. In a matter of only a few days, his life had completely turned around.
But
Izuku still couldn't help but think about the past. Izuku hadn't told Shoyuta yet, but he was getting nightmares. It wasn't anything new, he has been getting nightmares ever since the first time he killed someone, but he wondered if they would ever go away. Not like Izuku deserved them to go away, not after what he did. Izuku laid down on his bed. Maybe one day he could put it behind him. What a stupid thought. Days passed, then weeks and months. Before Izuku knew it, it was July 15th. Izuku hadn't had a birthday in so long that he had almost completely forgotten about the concept, so he was more than a little surprised to wake up one Sunday morning and leave his room only for Shoyuta to tell him to get dressed immediately with a serious expression. Izuku obviously listened, but he was quite nervous. What happened? Did he do something wrong? Is this where his stay with Shoyuta ends and he'll be sent to an orphanage? Thoughts like these rang through Izuku's head as he sat in the car. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't even notice where Shoyuta had taken him.
the park.
He just walked behind Shoyuta, following him but not taking in his surroundings, at least not until Shoyuta stopped, and Izuku looked up to see Zashi, Mori, Himiko, and Shinso around a picnic table full of food and a cake. Happy birthday! They shouted in unison, and Izuku only just realized what day it was. Izuku started tearing up at this, you guys. Izuku wiped the tears away and went and hugged each of them tightly. Then they all gathered around the cake, and Izuku blew the candles out. They had food, and afterwards cake. Izuku also realized this was the first time his two best friends would meet, so he formally introduced Himiko and Shinso. Izuku was already super happy, but was even happier when he got presents. From Shinso, a new notebook, since he had been noticing his old one was almost full. From Himiko, he got a bandana which said Fawn Club on it as a reminder of one of the first things the two had bonded over. From Zashi and Mori, he got a pile of new clothes and books, and also some stuffed animals, which he was a little embarrassed about his friends seeing. Shoyuta said his present was at home for when they went back. Izuku was officially 11, and Izuku even looked 11 now, as he had fully recovered from his malnourishment a few weeks ago and gotten quite a bit taller now, finally being around as tall as he should be. They continued to celebrate, and the trio of Himiko, Shinso, and Izuku had a blast, all hanging out together. Himiko somehow persuaded Shinso and taught him how to climb a tree as well, and they all sat chatting in the tree for a while before Shinso had to head home, and so did Himiko. Shoyuta, Zashi, Mori, and Izuku went back to the apartment, and when Izuku went to go put all his gifts in his room, he found a small calico form curled up on his messy bed. Izuku just looked at Shoyuta, and Shoyuta whistled innocently. Izuku sighed and picked the kitten up. They were a cute dilute calico of the colors ginger, white and gray with green eyes that seemed to reflect Izuku's own soul. They meowed in Izuku's arms and climbed up Izuku's shirt, up his shoulders, and rested on top Izuku's fluffy head of green curly hair. "What you gonna name them, little listener?" Zashi asked in his usual dramatic fashion. Caramel, Izuku said after a moment of thought, and he just sat on the couch, not daring to move a muscle in case it disturbed the kitten atop his head. Izuku came to school on Monday very happy and bubbly. He had been doing very well in school and was the top student in his class. He even read books and started studying at higher grade levels because he already knew everything they learnt in the grade he was currently in. Izuku hadn't socialized outside of Shin so much, but he had been nothing but kind to his classmates, and they were the same. For the most part, Izuku's good mood was suddenly evaporated during first break when a kid a grade above him basically dragged him over to the side of the school before he could go talk to Shinso. "Hey there, dragon boy," the kid with bright orange hair and blue eyes said after letting go of Izuku's arm. "Rumor says you have a cool, powerful quirk, but have never demonstrated. I've formed this sort of group that basically runs the school, and with a smart but like you we could be even stronger. But we gotta see a little performance to make sure your quirk is as strong as the rumors say," the orange-haired kid said, and at this point Izuku was just trying to hold back his shaking and failing miserably. "Well, thanks for the offer, but I am not interested in joining your group," Izuku said shakily. Well, that's not an option. You join the group, and if you refuse, we will torment you until you accept. My dad's a pro hero, so you don't want to mess with me, the orange-haired kid said, and the two other kids, one with large claws and the other with rock hair, nodded in agreement. The tears were threatening to break through the dam of Izuku's eyes. Well, that doesn't sound very heroic. Bullying other kids, Izuku mumbled, and he was suddenly pushed harshly against the wall, knocking all the air out of him.
What did you say?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Want to try that again? I think I heard that you would happily demonstrate your quirk, the orange-haired kid said with a strained smile and annoyance leaking from his voice. Izuku stood up from where he had fallen on his knees. I said, that's not what a hero would do. Izuku shouted, and even he didn't know where the sudden outburst came from. Okay. I tried doing this the nice way, but since you are being so difficult, well, just have to force that quirk out of you. The orange-haired kid yelled and threw a punch. Luckily, Izuku had been expecting that, so predictable, and dodged. The orange-haired kid's fist collided with the wall, and Izuku heard a painful crunch. The walls was perfectly fine, but the bleeding knuckles of the kid weren't. You idiots, what are you waiting for? Get him. The orange-haired kid shouted, now clutching his fist. The large clawed one attacked first with again a predictable barrage of swipes from the claws. Izuku kept dodging them easily before dodging completely the last one, and it ended with the kid's claws embedded in the wood of a tree. The rock-haired one went next, turning his arms into rocks, and again just throwing sloppy punches at Izuku, which once again Izuku dodged with practiced ease. Izuku found an opening and took it, elbowing the kid in the stomach, and he fell back to the ground with an ack, and clutched his stomach tight. Izuku was about to run away, but an air blast stopped him, the orange-haired kid. The air blast sent Izuku flying into a tree, and for a second all Izuku saw was white. Then his vision returned just in time to see the orange-haired kid was in front of him again, and about to throw another punch. Izuku was too slow.
How could he forget about him?
Izuku wouldn't be able to dodge fast enough. Oh no. No. Primal survival instincts which Izuku had suppressed for so long came crashing back, and Izuku didn't remember what happened next. It was all a blur. The next thing Izuku knew, he was no longer on the battlefield, but instead he was in the nurse's office with Shinso, and was that Shoyuta? Standing over him, with worried expressions. Shinso.
Dad.
Izuku said in a raspy and dry voice. Here, have some water, Zuku, Shinso said, giving Izuku a glass of water. Izuku gulped it down immediately before breathing for a second and jumping straight back into questioning. What happened? Why am I in the nurse's office? Izuku asked. Shoyuta and Shinso shared a concerned look before Shoyuta spoke. What was the last thing you remember? The bullies. The one with orange hair was about to punch me. Then everything is blurry and fuzzy after that. Izuku said while rubbing his head. Okay, well, problem child, I don't want you to panic at the information I'm about to tell you. Shoyuta said, and Izuku nodded, confused as ever. You seem to have fought against the bullies, and by that I mean basically tiered them a new one, not literally. But it was while using your quirk. Shoyuta seemed to be waiting for a negative reaction, and so was Shinso, even if he didn't know all the details and only knew that Izuku didn't like his quirk. But that negative reaction didn't come. Izuku just blinked, and maybe it was because he was still in shock, but he didn't really care. But they're alive, right? Izuku asked, and Shoyuta nodded. To that, Izuku shrugged. Then I don't care. It could have ended a lot worse, and as long as they're still breathing, I'm counting it as a win. Shoyuta and Shinso were dumbfounded, especially Shinso. There was a long silence, which was only broken when the school secretary came in. Mr. Aizawa? The principal would like to see you now. Oh, and since you're awake, you can come to Midoriya, she said, and Shoyuta nodded before turning to Izuku. You feel good enough to walk? Izuku nodded. The two of them went to the office, and Shinso waited outside. When they entered, there was the principal and two pairs of parents. Mr. Aizawa, I suppose you know why we called you here? The principal said, and when her gaze swept over Izuku, it had a look of disgust in it, and only now was Izuku starting to feel the usual guilt and shame that came whenever he used his quirk. Yes, I was informed that Izuku had been in a fight, Shoyuta said, sitting down on a chair, and Izuku hesitantly sat on the other. Yes, It seems your son expressed unprovoked aggression and used his quirk without permission on school grounds against other defenseless children, the principal said, and the other adults seemed to nod in agreement. Not Shoyuta. Izuku knows Shoyuta well enough that the aura he was emitting, which at first glance might seem like just shallow tension, was much deeper, more akin to wrath. Really? I was informed that the children in question attack my son unprovoked, and he was just defending himself, Shoyuta said, leaning forward a bit with a serious expression and ice in his voice. Well, that informant must have been Midoriya, because everyone here agrees otherwise. He definitely lied. I'm sorry, I know it's hard to swallow when your child lies to you. Your son will have to apologize to the boys immediately and will be given detention for the rest of the school year. He is lucky we don't expel him, the principal said in a final tone that made Izuku shiver. Shoyuta leaned in a little more. Tell me, do you have any personal attachment to the children? Shoyuta asked. Well, yes, it was my son who was the main victim, and these here next to me are the other two boys' parents. We have no time for petty questions like this, Aizawa. My husband is a pro-hero, you know, and if you don't take the right disciplinary action, he could put an investigation forth and separate you from your son, she said with the hint of a smirk. The other parents weren't hiding their pleasure about the situation they thought they had control over. Shoyuta leaned back to sit straight again and took a deep, long breath, and Izuku could swear he heard Shoyuta counting to 10. The school has CCTV footage, right? I will acquire it and see for myself what happened, because I know Izuku would never hurt someone unprovoked. And don't try to edit it. I know the signs of edited footage in my sleep, Shoyuta said, his voice filled with unspoken wrath and ice thicker than a glacier. Shoyuta got up. Come on, Izuku, and Izuku followed him out the door away from the pale principal and parents. When they left the office, Shoyuta sighed, and Izuku just went, You mean the sleep you hardly get? With a smirk, Shoyuta chuckled at that before making a shooing motion. All right, go on back to class. You and Shinso. I'll deal with this, don't worry. Izuku and Shinso nodded and headed back to class. They got a few stares from their classmates, but apart from that, the rest of the day went as normal. After school, Shoyuta came and picked Izuku up, and they drove to UA in a perfect silence. Once at UA, instead of heading to the teacher's lounge, they headed straight to Nedzu's office. Nedzu in the recent months had become something like an uncle for Izuku, but this was the first time since they first met that Izuku felt nervous walking into the big office. Come in, Nedzu said cheerfully, and sipping a cup of tea. Nedzu, I've already briefed you over the phone, Shoyuta said, sitting down, and Izuku sat next to him. Ah, yes. It seems that the principal of your school, Izuku, is covering up some things their son did. Can we please get your account of the events today? Nedzu asked, and Izuku sighed. Of course, Izuku said, and explained everything, and tried to repeat what they said word for word. By the end, Nedzu's smile was strained, and Shoyuta was straight up looking like he was about to kill someone. Well, if what the student bragged is true, and it most likely is from the attempted cover-up, then I believe we should take a bit of a closer look at this school, Nedzu said with an evil smirk forming on his face. It was no secret that Nedzu despised discrimination and placing others in higher positions they did not earn. It was also no secret that before Nedzu became principal, he had a habit of shutting down schools or places in general that had these tendencies. You can run along now, Izuku. Aizawa, I trust you'll help me in these matters, Nedzu said, and Shoyuta had an evil glint in his eye as he nodded. The day continued as normal after that. Izuku went to the teacher's lounge and helped Zashi with some paperwork he was struggling with before he went home with Shoyuta. Izuku then proceeded to be almost murdered when Caramel thought his napping face was a nice pillow to sleep on. The next day, Izuku went to school very nervous. He had his guard ridiculously high up, and even though Shoyuta said he didn't have to go, Izuku still wanted to see Shinso, as there was no way they could contact each other to make arrangements to meet up since neither had a phone. It seemed the world was oblivious to Izuku's discomfort and just continued on like normal, almost like Izuku hadn't beat 3 kids up yesterday in a blind state of self-defense. The classes started, and everything seemed normal. Then break came, and Izuku ran over to Shinso. Izuku, are you okay from yesterday? What happened? Shinso asked, and Izuku retold the story of how the bullies tried to make him use his quirk and ultimately succeeded even if Izuku didn't remember it. That's terrible.
Come on.
Let's go and eat at the bench. Shinso said, and Izuku nodded. At this point, Izuku started to notice glances and stares being thrown his way. All he could hope for was that the bullies didn't spread word of what happened. All those hopes went down the drain when a girl from another class came up to Izuku. "Hey, is it true you beat up Kane and his lackeys?" Izuku guessed that Kane was the name of the orange-haired kid. Izuku became uncomfortable as everyone around then started staring and trying to hear the answer.
Well,
"I didn't really beat them up. I acted in self-defense when they were going to beat me up," Izuku said, rubbing the back of his neck, and the whole hallway was silent. Then the girl gasped, "So you did beat him up?" she said in a tone of disbelief. Shinso quickly dragged Izuku away, but that didn't stop the whispers they heard as they went down the hallway. Most were unintelligible, but some kids were being particularly loud, and Izuku made out the words, "villain" and "dangerous." This immediately set Izuku off as he started to feel very bad about himself and could feel the tears about to come on. Shinso saw this and quickly took Izuku into an empty bathroom and threw a bunch of paper tissues at Izuku's face. "Don't cry. They're all idiots and know nothing about what happened," Shinso said, and Izuku nodded while burying his face in the paper. Shinso sighed. "Look, I'm sure it's going to be fine. You've told me about the terrifying might of Nedzu, so I'm not even sure the school will be open by the end of the week," Shinso said, and Izuku nodded again as he splashed some water of his face. They left, and the day continued relatively normal. Shinso ended up being right as the elementary school was shut down by the end of the week because of abuse of power, inability to enforce the rules, and a few other things that Izuku couldn't remember, but didn't really care for. Shoyuta, at the end of the week, dropped a bombshell of a question. "Since your elementary school shut down," he says it in a way that makes it sound like he wasn't partially responsible for it, "Nedzu offered for you to be his personal student because of how much more intelligent you seem to be. That is at least until you go to middle school, and only if you want to dash." Shoyuta was cut off when Izuku hugged the life force out of him in agreement with a huge beaming smile. Later that day, when he was hanging out with Himiko, he mentioned how his school was shut down. "Oh, you poor thing," Himiko said while swinging her legs from the tree branch. "You must be devastated to be separated from your class." She said it like it was the end of the world, which it might as well have been for Himiko, since she cherished connections between people like gold. Izuku not so much. He didn't really know anyone in his class apart from Shinso, and Izuku had a suspicion they would meet again. Izuku soon started lessons with Nedzu at UA. How it would work was Shoyuta would drop Izuku off at Nedzu's office at the start of the day, and Izuku basically had the same schedule as an actual school day, except he was doing much higher grade stuff that actually challenged him and was fun. Izuku's life had truly turned for the better, even if there were bumps here and there. For the next few years, Izuku learned under Nedzu, and even graduated normal middle school classes 2 years earlier. Because of this, after that point, most of Izuku's school time was replaced with time training with either Zashi, Mori, or Shoyuta, though never with his Quirk. On Izuku's 12th birthday, he got a phone, and soon he and Shinso exchanged numbers so that they could interact more, since after the school shut down they only rarely saw each other at the park. Himiko made a lot of friends and hobbies over the years, but always found time for Izuku. Not long after Izuku's school shut down, it was truly discovered the fragile, low self-esteem Izuku had when one day a student at UA made a snark comment about Izuku, which resulted in a near breakdown. After this, and few heart-to-heart discussions with Shoyuta about his past, Caramel was, after a bit of training, made Izuku's official Sevis emotional support animal and would comfort Izuku out of any panic attacks or breakdowns he had. Izuku also soon started to build a sort of large collection of books. Their small bookcase was very much protesting against this, and they had to get a second one just for Izuku's own books. His analysis notebooks only became more and more detailed and became a full hobby of Izuku. He had about 16 now. It seemed that Izuku's life was truly for the better, but he did occasionally have doubts. They were small, but they were there. One day, though, it seemed to peak when Izuku had just gotten some groceries and was heading back home one Friday. He was going under a bridge when suddenly the sewer drain behind him was busted into the air, and out came a huge sludge form. "You'll make a nice skin suit, kid," was all Izuku heard before he was suddenly engulfed into a foul-smelling liquid. It forced its way down his throat, and he couldn't breathe. Was this how Izuku was going to die?
No.
No way. Izuku was not going to die here. The sludge villain must have been very surprised when the small form of the boy disappeared and was replaced with a big dragon that instantly tore the sludge away. And as soon as any air was allowed into its lungs, it fired an entire barrage of flames. Turns out the sludge was slightly flammable as it caught fire easily and was screaming in pain. Unfortunately, only slightly, as it soon managed to put the fire out, but after that was quickly pinned by the glare of a dragon almost twice its size cramped in the small space of the underpass, and the villain got a good look at the beast. It had green scales and piercing green eyes with large black claws and a row of pointed teeth that were revealed as it snarled. It looked down on the sludge villain like it was nothing more than a piece of dirt stuck on its shoe. It didn't help that the smoke coming from the beast's mouth and nostrils made it even more intimidating, as it reminded the villain it could set the entire vicinity on fire with a single breath. It coughed out some sludge, but apart from that kept the glare unbroken, seemingly trying to decide what to do with the villain. Then a voice came from the sewer drain. "Do not fear, for I am here," yelled All Might, and jumped out from the sewer with a huge cheesy smile that may or may not have faltered a bit when he saw a huge dragon pinning the villain he had been chasing down with nothing more than a glare, and an intimidating one at that. Izuku glanced at who had just arrived, and when he saw who it was, immediately relaxed, but not before swiping mercilessly at the sludge villain, sending them into the wall and unconsciousness as they seemed to fall limp. The dragon disappeared in a poof of smoke and was replaced by a short, messy, green-haired teenager in a black hoodie. "All Might," the child said with sparkles in his eyes, like he hadn't just completely demolished a villain. Tashinori tried not to waver. "Ah, yes, it is I. Thank you, brave citizen, for helping in the capture of this villain," he said, putting the sludge into a soda bottle. "You know you shouldn't use your quirk without a license, but I'll give you a pass," Tashinori said, keeping up his smile. The boy, who had been smiling and happily bouncing in place, suddenly seemed to deflate by that comment as his face turned to a carefully blank expression. "That guy just tried to kill me. I think I was more than justified than to act in self-defense, and the only way I could defend myself was using my quirk," the boy said, and went over and picked up a bag of what looked like groceries that seemed to have been discarded to the side, probably when he had been attacked. "Yes, that is a valid reason. My apologies for being a little late. The sewer system is more complicated than you think," Tashinori said, and the boy had a small smile at that as he walked back up to him, and then he pulled a notebook out of nowhere. "Can you sign my notebook?" he said again, practically bouncing in place. Tashinori nodded and signed it quickly before starting to leave. "Well, I have to get this guy to the station," he said, getting ready to jump into the air, but the boy's neck snapped toward him at that. "Wait, I have a question," he said, running towards him. Tashinori thought back to his time limit. If he was correct, he had another 20 minutes. "All right, but make it quick," he said, and the boy took a sharp intake of air.
Do
you think someone can be a hero, even if they've done terrible things?" the boy said, and Tashinori thought for a second before answering. "Well, it depends if they regret those things and truly want to change," he answered. Questions like these were always hard and changed depending on the person they were referring to.
Oh.
"Of course," the boy said, and had a faltering smile. Thanks for answering. Sorry for wasting your time." All Might jumped into the sky, and Izuku was left all alone with his thoughts. Izuku did want to change, and he did regret what he did, but Izuku was afraid he would never change, as he did it again. He used his quirk just now and hurt someone even if they were a villain, and Izuku did justify it, but there was a voice of betrayal in the back of Izuku's head telling him he was still a danger to others. And as for the regret, if faced in that situation again, Izuku would probably do it again. It was him or them in those matches, and Izuku didn't want to die. So in Izuku's doubtful and saddened mind, he couldn't be a hero, even if All Might's words were supposed to be encouraging. He started walking home, again lost in his thoughts. He wished Caramel were with him then. She always could drag him out of this thinking, but she wasn't, and Izuku was alone dealing with this. Then an explosion happened nearby, and Izuku with many others went to check it out. There were heroes and a crowd. Maybe a villain fight? No, a hostage situation. Izuku managed to get to the front of the crowd and saw the villain. The sludge villain. Wait, wasn't he with All Might? Maybe something went wrong. Did Izuku's question give the villain time to plan an escape? Oh no, he messed everything up again. The heroes were complaining about how they couldn't go into the fight. One was putting out fires, another was helping people escape the buildings, and the other one was catching rubble, but none of them were even attempting to help the hostage. The water one could use his quirk to dilute the liquid substance of the villain, making it easier for the hostage to swim through. There's already the other two making sure everyone was away from the fire, so couldn't he just do that? This was unbelievable. The third one, who has death arms, Izuku believed had stopped catching rubble, and instead of helping was just standing by, while someone suffocated. He was complaining about how his quirk wasn't suited for this. That's just stupid. Heroes can't just wait around for a situation where their quirks are suited. That was just a one-trick pony move. He was hero. He graduated from a school where they were taught these things. Couldn't he use his head and find an alternative way around? Are these people fully dependent on their quirks? Then the hostage looked at the people standing by, and red scared eyes looked back at green frustrated ones. Izuku's body moved on its own. He ran, and in a puff of smoke he transformed into his dragon form. The Sludge villain's eyes widened comically at the sight. Since Izuku's scales made him immune to fire, he easily crossed the gap between the bystanders and the villain. "Oh no, not you again." The villain shouted and sent some sludge at Izuku, which he easily batted away with his claws before skidding to halt and sending his tail cutting through the sludge and pushing the hostage out. The blonde was pushed to the side and was coughing up some sludge, gasping for air. Similar to the last time, he fought the Sludge villain Izuku with a mighty strike of his claws, batted the villain into the wall, and again they went unconscious as they hit the ground. There was still fire going on around Izuku, so he flapped his wings, creating a huge gust of wind that quickly put all remaining fires out. A little exhausted, Izuku turned back to his normal form and stood there breathing heavily for a second. It was silent, and Izuku saw the shock on everyone's faces. For a moment, fear struck through him before the crowd erupted into cheers and joy. The heroes were stunned for a bit longer, and Izuku decided that he didn't need to stick around long since he saw a few cameras of the media starting to make their way past the crowd, so he just waved shyly before picking up the once again discarded groceries and running in the opposite direction into the crowd at the other end, away from the heroes, and put his hood up. He managed to exit the crowd and head home quickly with the groceries. When Izuku got home, he laid the groceries bag on the counter. The eggs were almost definitely broken. He didn't even bother unpacking it as he collapsed onto the couch. Caramel immediately greeted him and sat in his fluffy curls to try and help release the mountain of stress he was feeling. Izuku turned the news on and unsurprisingly saw himself and footage of the villain attack and him saving the hostage. There were already a few theories on who Izuku was, ranging from a new hero that just looked very young making his debut to a vigilante. No one seemed to guess that Izuku had just been another bystander that got sick of watching a kid suffocate because the heroes were being incompetent. The upside to that little encounter was that Izuku's mind couldn't have been farther from his self-deprecating thoughts he had been thinking earlier. Katsuki just sat there in shock as the heroes and some paramedics were checking him if he was okay. Katsuki must have imagined it, right? But it was so clear. The green scales, the huge wings, and then the form with messy green curls afterwards. Katsuki could have sworn he was just saved by his childhood best friend Izuku Midoriya. But that was impossible. Izuku was dead. He had gone missing years ago, and the mortality rate for children missing over a year was almost 100%. If Izuku had been found, Katsuki would know about it. Right? There was no way. Izuku
was dead.
The words repeated and swirled in Katsuki's mind even as the old hag chewed him out for being weak and getting caught by the villain. But every time it repeated, the same images flashed in Katsuki's head of the messy green curls. Katsuki had not gotten a good look at the face, but no, it couldn't be. Katsuki sat in his bedroom and looked at all the footage from the fight on his phone. And sure enough, there it was.
As clear as day.
The form of a teenager the same age as Katsuki turned, looked at a camera, and waved shyly before running in the opposite direction into a crowd. The freckles, the hair, even the sheet choices and fashion, as his hoodie had the word hoodie printed on it like many of his old shirts had when they were kids, and Izuku had thought it funny choice of clothing.
But no.
It was the smile. What gave it away was the smile. The shy smile and wave Katsuki had seen so many times given to him before they parted ways for the day. It was the last gesture Katsuki ever saw Izuku do so many years ago. When Izuku gave him that wave while saying they would play together tomorrow as he walked out the school with his mom. Then Izuku didn't come to school the next day. The old hag couldn't contact his mom, and it was soon found that she was dead, and Izuku was missing. Despite what Katsuki dared to pretend, he had never really moved on from his friend's disappearance and possible death. At first, he was in total denial. At the beginning of every school day, he would stare at Izuku's empty seat even after the teacher stopped calling for Izuku and roll call. Every Sunday, the days Izuku would come over to play, he would wait in the living room for someone to ring the doorbell, and when it did happen but it wasn't Izuku at the door, he would just storm up to his room set. Izuku had been the only true friend Katsuki had since before they got their quirk. The extras followed Katsuki around because they had nothing better to do, but Izuku did it because he trusted Katsuki and wanted to help him achieve their shared goal of becoming heroes. After they got their quirks, Izuku had been the only person who didn't want to be his friend because of the promising future Katsuki had, because they both had promising futures. Then Izuku went missing and Katsuki completely cut himself off from the extras because they all forgot about Izuku's existence in literally 2 days. All the old memories were drudged up from the inky depths of Katsuki's mind as he stared at that FING nerd smiling at the camera on his phone. The BSTRD disappeared for 8 FING years and then came out of nowhere like this without batting a FINGI. Katsuki immediately started to search on lists of missing children found. He started first with the most recent lists and worked his way back until he found Izuku's name. Izuku had been found 4 FING years ago after being missing for 4 years. There weren't any details about it except where Izuku had been found. Katsuki's stomach dropped into the 5th dimension, never to be heard from again. Izuku had been found in an illegal quirk fighting ring.
Those.
FING. BSTRDS. Katsuki was going to rip someone's throat out. He didn't know who and frankly he didn't care. But right now Katsuki's first priority was to find Izuku. He was going to find him and FING sheet on his non-existent grave. Katsuki didn't know if he wanted to kill Izuku for forgetting about him or FING hug him because he wasn't dead. Soon Shoyuta came home from being dragged out to hang out with Zashi and Mori, and he immediately glared Izuku down to the ground. I saw the news report on my phone, he said, activating his quirk at Izuku, who was just sipping some tea Nedzu had got him addicted to.
Yeah.
I moved before I could think, was Izuku's only reply, and Shoyuta sighed as he dropped his quirk. Why, kid? There were heroes around, Shoyuta asked, and Izuku just raised an eyebrow at him. Did you see how they were acting before I jumped it? Incompetent. Death Arms was complaining how his quirk wasn't suited for this, as he was watching some poor kid suffocate. I had already been through that, so I knew it was bad, Izuku said in protest. Now it was Shuta's turn to raise an eyebrow. You had. Izuku sighed before putting his tea down. Earlier that day the same villain attacked me. I defended myself with my quirk, and then a hero took the villain away, but I guess the villain escaped them. Izuku said conveniently, leaving out which hero had taken the villain away. Shoyuta pasted a hand down his face in an exhausted gesture. All right, I'm giving you a pass, but you're grounded from going to the park for the next 2 days, Shoyuta said, and Izuku shrugged. Better than paying a fine for illegal quirk usage. Izuku just laid down on the couch and started reading a book he had recently gotten as a recommendation from Zashi. What a hectic Friday chapter text. About a year after the Sludge incident, where Izuku was also chewed out by Zashi, Mori, Hitoshi, and Nedzu, Izuku stood at the front gates of UA. Hitoshi said he was also going to take the exam, so Izuku was also routing for him. Nedzu had offered Izuku to take the recommended student exam, but Izuku wanted to take the normal one because he didn't want to feel like he was getting special treatment for no reason. Izuku was walking towards the school he had walked to so many times, but this time was different. This time he would be applying to finally make his hero dreams come true. Saying he was nervous was an understatement. He had Caramel balancing on his shoulder with her little vest on just because of how terribly nervous he was. Then he tripped. Izuku abruptly stopped falling when a nice girl saved him with her quirk. Izuku was so happy he had Himiko as one of his best friends, or he would have probably died on the spot. This is all so nerve-wracking, don't you think? The nice girl asked, and Izuku nodded. Yeah, it really is. Thanks for catching me, by the way. They chatted a bit as they entered into the UA building and separated when going to their seats. There in the auditorium, Izuku found Hitoshi and sat next to him. They also chatted a bit before the presentation started, and Caramel found her spot sitting on Izuku's head in his green curls. Luckily, she laid down quite flat so the person behind Izuku could see. Izuku was very happy to see his uncle Zashi as his hero persona start explaining the exam, even if he also did not give a yeah at the beginning. Then, at one point, a boy with blue hair stood up and asked the question about the zero-pointer, and then he pointed to Izuku, and Izuku internally died by having the spotlight suddenly on him. And you? Should you really be taking the exam if you need to bring your service animal? That is highly unprofessional, the boy said, and Izuku saw the twitch in both Zashi and Hitoshi's face. Hey, calm down there. We have the exam open to everyone, and for it to be fair, we also allow people service animals if they need it. No need to call out other contestants like that, Zashi said in a slightly strained voice before explaining the zero-pointer. All right, thank you, the boy said before sitting down, and Izuku exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding in. Most of the faculty at UA had met Caramel, and Nedzu agreed it was okay. She was there, so he was more annoyed than embarrassed by that call-out. The presentation soon ended, and they got on buses to go to the fake cities, and luckily Izuku and Hitoshi were in the same city. They chatted on the bus. Ever since Hitoshi met Shoyuta, and he told him how he also wanted to be a hero, Shoyuta has been training him alongside Izuku, so they were both pretty confident. Soon they made it to the fake city, and Caramel decided to finally wake up from her nap on top of Izuku's head, which she was a master of balancing on. She jumped down to his shoulder and made sure he was okay before getting ready to leap off at the slightest gesture by Izuku. Izuku and Hitoshi went to the front of the crowd and got ready while stretching. Then Zashi yelled go as the doors suddenly opened. Immediately Hitoshi and Izuku sprinted forward, and Caramel leaped off to the side, but never staying more than 20 feet from Izuku. The rest were stunned, but when Zashi pointed out how there are no countdowns in real battles, they all started moving. Izuku transformed in a puff of smoke when a two-pointer appeared. He immediately smashed it with his claws, and he saw Hitoshi making two robots crash into each other by chasing him at the same time out of the corner of his eye. Izuku decided Hitoshi would be fine and started destroying robots left and right, but leaving a few behind for other contestants. Caramel would occasionally grab his attention if someone needed help. Everything was going smoothly. Too smoothly. The zero-pointer came, and Izuku thought it was not up to scale. He was about to run with everyone else when heard someone weakly call out for help. Izuku turned his head to see through the smoke and dust someone was stuck under the rubble. Not good. Not good. Not good. Not good. Izuku did not have time for this. He made a split-second decision without even thinking. He ran and jumped, now quickly flying up to the zero-pointer and building speed increasingly fast. When Izuku finally got to the zero-pointer's face, he had built up so much speed and force that when he slammed into it, it made a huge dent and seemed to stutter backwards for a second. A second was all Izuku needed. He backed up and took a huge breath before exhaling burning hot blue flames that melted the zero-pointer's face, and it tipped backwards and officially seemed to stop moving. Now Izuku just glided down to the ground and not so gracefully landed. He went up to the girl who had managed to get herself out of the rubble. Are you okay? Izuku asked while breathing heavily. The girl merely nodded, and Zashi announced time was up, which was a great relief to Izuku as he poofed back to his normal form and landed back first on the ground in a heap of exhaustion. He wiped away the blood drip from his nose that was a sign of Quirk overuse, and he just laid there. He was so tired he wanted to sleep, but he had a splitting headache that wouldn't let him. After a bit, and recovery girl asking if he was okay, and also a small crowd forming around Izuku, Izuku finally managed to stand up, and Caramel bounded over to him and jumped into his arms before climbing up onto his head. Everyone was staring at the insane kid who took down the zero-pointer, but Izuku didn't care. He just walked out towards the buses like he wasn't on the verge of collapse. Shoyuta pinched the bridge of his nose when he got home, and Izuku was collapsed onto the couch. Didn't even make it to the bed. He had seen what Izuku did, and wasn't surprised in all honesty. Not only was using his quirk that much new since Izuku rarely used it, but also he pushed it way over the limit with that speed and fire. Shoyuta just sighed. "You really are a problem child," he mumbled. Izuku woke up the next morning in his bed burrito warped in maybe 6 layers of blankets, with an additional cat named Caramel sleeping on his chest. He was confused for a second before remembering what happened at the exams, and how he had immediately collapsed onto the couch when he got home. He could vaguely remember Hitoshi scolding him about overusing his quirk, but also being very surprised he did that on their way out of UA, before they parted ways at the train station. Izuku groaned a little as he could still feel the phantom of his headache coming back with a vengeance now that he opened his very light, sensitive eyes. Caramel was awoken by this and quickly jumped off of Izuku's chest and watched with amusement as Izuku tried for the next 5 minutes to get through all 6 layers of blankets. He sat on his bed and stretched with a huge yawn before getting changed into something more casual than his black school clothing he had been wearing when he left UA. Izuku opened his door and saw a sign that fell off when the handle was pushed down. It read, "Do not make any loud noises, I'm sleeping." A sigh escaped Izuku, but his attention was immediately taken by the smell of bacon and eggs being cooked. He quietly shuffled over to the kitchen with Caramel following behind just as quietly. Izuku doesn't know where that habit came from. He had always just moved quietly like a cat when he was relaxed. When Shoyuta turned around with 2 freshly prepared plates of bacon and eggs, he jumped almost a foot in the air as he saw Izuku sitting at the table already. "Wah, when did you even get here?" Shoyuta asked, and Izuku shrugged. "I don't know. When was I moved to my bed and then constricted by 6 layers of blankets?" Izuku answered cheekily. Shoyuta only rolled his eyes as he put the plates down, and they soon dug in. As usual, the breakfast was eaten in a comfortable silence. Izuku had never been particular to initiating conversation when he was busy. Soon Izuku finished and did another stretch before Shoyuta spoke again. "So, what was that at the exams?" Shoyuta asked like he was discussing the weather and not the absurd amounts of quirk overuse Izuku did. "I panicked," was all Izuku could answer, and Shoyuta seemed to accept that as he just nodded while finishing up his own breakfast. After a while longer of lazing around, Izuku took his phone, went over to the door, and put his shoes on. "I'm going to the park to meet up with Hitoshi and Himiko." He called, and all he got was a grunt in return from Shoyuta that signified approval. Izuku left with Caramel hitching a ride on his shoulder, and after a calm and quiet walk he came to the park. Surprisingly, he saw that Hitoshi was the first there, and Hitoshi soon came up to him, and without any warning hit Izuku over the head with a rolled-up newspaper, carefully avoiding hitting Caramel because she was too pure for the world. "You
are
insane," he said slowly, like Izuku didn't already know that. Izuku just rubbed the back of his head before jumping for the first distraction. "Hey, where's Himiko?" he asked, and Hitoshi looked around for a second before shrugging. "I don't know. Haven't seen her for the last few weeks. We said we'd meet today, but she isn't here yet," Hitoshi said, puzzled. "But her house is the closest to the park." Izuku was also very puzzled. Hida hadn't seen Himiko in a while, but they had specifically planned this meeting, which made it all the stranger. "Maybe we should go see if she slept in? You know where her house is, right?" Hitoshi asked, and Izuku nodded. They left the park and soon stood in front of Himiko's door, or at least her parents' door. Izuku knocked and promptly realized he hadn't met Himiko's parents before, but from how she spoke of them, they were nice people. Soon a short woman with long brown hair and yellow eyes just like Himiko's answered the door. She seemed a little shocked to see 2 people she had never met at her door, but Izuku quickly spoke before she could jump to conclusions. "Hi. You must be Miss Toga. I'm Izuku Midoriya, and this is Hitoshi Shinso. We're your daughter's friends, and we wanted to know if she was okay, because we haven't been able to contact her in the last few weeks," Izuku quickly introduced. It was also strange now that he thought about it how she hadn't been answering her phone. Himiko would answer in a heartbeat any call or text Izuku sent, so it was kind of unnerving. The woman seemed to stiffen at the mention of Himiko, and there was a sad look in her eyes. Caramel immediately got ready to comfort Izuku in any bad news. "Well, you see, Her voice cracked slightly, and she shook her head. "Why don't you boys come inside, and I can explain to you what happened," she said. Izuku and Hitoshi shared a concerned glance, but both came inside. Himiko's house was very nice and homey, but there was an air of sadness in the silence of house, which worried Izuku a bit. They went into the living room and sat on the couch. "Okay, well, I assume you two don't go to her school?" she asked. Izuku and Hitoshi both nodded in unison. "Well, a few weeks ago, there was a small incident. I don't know how to tell you this because from what I've heard from Himiko, you are her best friends, but Himiko killed someone before running from the school and going missing." It was like all the air in the room turned to cement. Himiko. Their Himiko. The Himiko that made up silly little challenges and competitions, that made Izuku part of the official Fawn Club. The Himiko, which was so nice and bouncy and outgoing in every way, had killed someone and then run away. Caramel had now jumped onto Izuku's lap and was comforting him, or at least trying, but Izuku was too far in shock as he stared wide-eyed. Hitoshi spoke first after a deafening silence. "Why?" was all that came out of his mouth as Himiko's mother was silently tearing up. "We don't know. We were as shocked as you are." Himiko has always had this strange fascination with blood. That much was true. Once Izuku had cut himself on the tree they always climbed, and Himiko had started bombarding him with questions ranging from what his blood type was to how bad the pain he felt was, but we didn't think it would spiral out of control to the point she killed one of her classmates. At this point, Himiko's mother was full-on crying. Hitoshi went over and comforted her while Izuku was still buried under mountains of shock. The situation just seemed so unreal to him. So far away. Like it was all being muffled under a sheet of questioning and denial. After a while, Himiko's mother stopped crying and Hitoshi stood up with Izuku in tow and Caramel on his shoulder again. "I think we should leave. Please, if you can keep us updated if anything is found on her whereabouts," Hitoshi said, probably giving her his contact information. Izuku wasn't really paying attention. Himiko's mother nodded slowly before they both left. They didn't go back to the park. That place held so many memories of the three of them hanging out together. It would have been too painful. They both ended up just aimlessly walking through the streets in an unsettlingly calm silence. Izuku didn't notice it, but Hitoshi actually led him back to his apartment. They parted ways outside the building, and Izuku just walked in, and then into his apartment in complete silence. Shoyuta was sitting on the couch and turned his head to see Izuku as he entered. "Hey, how was your day out with your friends?" Shoyuta asked, but he didn't even get a look from Izuku in return, as Izuku just slowly walked over to his room and shut the door quietly. Izuku then proceeded to collapse onto his bed and just stare up at the ceiling for the next few hours. At one point, Shoyuta opened his door and poked his head in. "Hey kid, what happened?" he asked, and Izuku looked at him with dull eyes. "Himiko is missing." He left out the part about her killing someone. Who was he to judge someone for murder? He had committed the same crime many times. Shoyuta seemed to take a sharp intake of breath before exhaling quietly. You want to talk about it over lunch?" Shoyuta asked, and Izuku just rolled over to face the wall. "Not hungry," was his only reply. Shoyuta seemed to relent as Izuku heard his door close. After a while longer of staring at the wall, Izuku pulled out his phone and started searching any and all media about Himiko Toga, and there it was. A news article published a few weeks ago with a detailed witness report from one of Himiko's school friends about how they had found her crouched over the dead, bleeding body of their classmate on the last day before school break. It finally hit Izuku like a train wreck. This was reality. Up until that point, he had hoped Himiko would jump out of bush yelling surprise because that just seems like the kind of prank she would pull. But this was real. Himiko had killed someone and was now missing. It was worse than real. It was something Izuku had to personally deal with. Not some incident Izuku heard happened to someone but had zero impact on him.
No.
This was his closest friend the news article was referring to, and Izuku couldn't help but have a pit in his stomach as Caramel tried to comfort him by sitting on his chest and every so often smacking his face with her tail. Not in purpose, obviously, but it was still an attempt at making sure his thoughts didn't wander too far from reality. But right now, Izuku wanted to be anywhere but reality. Soon Izuku got his acceptance letter from UA, but it was just bittersweet because he didn't have Himiko there to celebrate with. For the next few weeks, Izuku didn't go out and stayed in. Caramel comforted him and Shoyuta tried his best to get him up in spirits, but not much was working. Izuku checked the news every day for anything about Himiko with no luck. Hitoshi called every few days to check in, and Izuku was happy Hitoshi got into the hero course. Before Izuku knew it, the first day of high school was upon him. He got into uniform and had the pleasure of arriving quite early with Shoyuta. Most would go to their classroom or explore, but Izuku right now was a sucker for routine and just sat in the teacher's lounge with Caramel on his lap and discussing the new batch of students this year with Cementos and Vlad King like they did every year since Izuku had come into their lives. Eventually the bell rang and Shoyuta had to basically drag Izuku to the class with Caramel pushing Izuku's legs from behind. Izuku really wanted to be excited for finally going to UA officially, but he just couldn't. He didn't have energy now that Himiko, his first friend, had disappeared. They arrived to the class to see two people talking in the doorway. Izuku recognized them both. One was the nice girl who had helped him not trip and fall on his face. He never caught her name. The other was the blue-haired boy who called him out for having a service animal. The thought of being in the same class as him already gave Izuku a headache. They didn't seem to notice Shoyuta and Izuku, but by the time they did, Shoyuta had already crawled back into his sleeping bag, and Caramel climbed up onto Izuku's head. Izuku was quite amused by the two's expression at seeing the caterpillar of a man on the floor, and just walked past them and to the first seat he saw, which was at the front. Soon the two others sat down with everyone else, and Izuku just sighed. Shoyuta announced he was their teacher and that they should get into PE uniform and head outside. Izuku already knew about Shuta's quirk assessment test and how it was meant to weed out the ones who didn't make the cut in terms of heroics, but it would be interesting to see it firsthand this time. After changing, he managed to find Hitoshi, who had sat at the back of the class, and they headed outside together in a comfortable silence. Once everyone else also gathered outside, Shoyuta explained the test, and many were outraged. Then Shoyuta called a blonde to the pitch and asked him to throw using his quirk. The blonde happily obliged, and an explosion came from his hand as he sent the ball flying.
Something about that was
familiar. Izuku couldn't place his finger on it. Shoyuta showed how far the ball traveled, and some girl made the mistake if saying it looked fun. Shoyuta then brutally crushed that thought as he said the one who came in last would be expelled. There it was. Everyone immediately snapped into focus. Much better. Hitoshi was very confused, but he saw how Izuku remained calm, so he also remained calm. Izuku maybe should have given him a heads up about Shuta's teaching methods on the first day.
Soon the test started.
Izuku felt his eyes drawn back to that blonde. Why did he seem so familiar? Maybe someone from his old elementary school?
No, not that.
The blonde seemed to not even notice Izuku's existence, which was good. On most of the tests Izuku got through easily with his semi-transformed form. He didn't transform entirely because none of the tests required that, and he would hate to scare his classmates. Hitoshi and him chatted leisurely between tests, and at one point the blue-haired boy noticed him and approached. This entire time Caramel had been hiding in a tree nearby watching since Izuku didn't want everyone's attention drawn elsewhere. Hello. I am Tanya Ida. I'm sorry for underestimating you in the exam just because of your service animal. Ida said a little too loudly for comfort, and Izuku was a little surprised he actually apologized. Maybe he was just a little too blunt with his thoughts? Oh, I'm Izuku Midoriya, and thanks for apologizing. I know you probably didn't mean it in any bad way, Izuku said much quieter than Ida had introduced himself. Hitoshi had a scowl. Yeah, and I'm Hitoshi Shinso, Hitoshi said while seemingly getting ready to move between Izuku and Ida. Then a third participant joined the conversation. Oh, it's you, Dragon Boy, the nice girl said as she approached the three of them. Izuku internally winced at the name as it brought back memories of his old elementary school and how everyone used to call him that instead of his actual name. It's Izuku Midoriya. Please don't call me that, Izuku said just loud enough for her to hear, and Caramel seemed to have spotted Izuku's distress and jumped from her tree running towards Izuku at a steady pace. Well, Emo Chaco Uraraka. Your quirk is so cool, Uraraka said with a happy smile. Izuku bent down a little, and Caramel jumped onto his shoulder. Thanks. It isn't that great, really, Izuku said after Caramel had found her place on his shoulder. Uraraka blinked at the sudden arrival of the cat while Ida wasted no time. This is your service animal, correct? Do they have a name? He asked, and Izuku nodded. Yeah, her name is Caramel, he said, and it seemed Uraraka finally snapped out of her trance. She is so cute. Wait. Why do you need a service animal? You seem fine to me, Uraraka asked, looking at Izuku with questioning eyes. This is when Hitoshi finally decided to jump in. He doesn't need to tell people why he needs a service animal, as that is kind of a personal question, he said a little too sternly to Uraraka, but Izuku knew he was just trying to look out for him. Uraraka blushed a little from embarrassment. Oh, you're right, I'm sorry, I didn't think when I asked, she said while rubbing the back of her neck. Izuku shook his head and gave Hitoshi a glance. No, it's all right. I just have really bad self-esteem and anxiety. Caramel helps me calm down if I start having panic attacks, he said a little too casually considering what he was talking about. Their conversation was cut short when Shoyuta told them to go on to the next exercise. After all was said and done, the class finished the exercise and stood anxiously waiting the results, well, except for Izuku, since he already had a good guess of where he was. Oh, and I was lying, no one us getting expelled. That was just a logical ruse, Shoyuta said as he showed the results, and over half the class sighed in relief and frustration. Well, that was a new one. Guess everyone here had potential. Izuku found his name in the 4th place. Unsurprising. He had great physical skills and could think around most any problem, but his quirk use needs practice since he's been ignoring it for the last few years. Izuku looked at the names above his. 1. Momo Yaoyorozu. 2. Shoto Todoroki. 3. Katsuki Bakugo. Why did the last one sound so familiar? It was like a weird feeling of déjà vu. He knew he had heard that name somewhere before, but where? Izuku heard someone yell and looked to see where the sound was coming from, only to find it was directed at him by the blonde from earlier, Bakugo. What the F are you doing here? He yelled with sparks flying from his palms as he charged at Izuku, but Izuku didn't need to deck him, because Shoyuta got there first with his capture weapon, and the spark stopped. You should really stop using your quirk, so I don't have to use mine. It gives me serious dry eye, Shoyuta said menacingly, and that seemed to semi-calm Bakugo down. Just enough for Shoyuta to let his capture weapon go. Hitoshi put himself between Izuku and Bakugo. Hey Aizawa, you okay? He asked, and Izuku nodded as Caramel rushed over from the shade. She had been lying in to make sure Izuku was okay. Everyone headed back to change, but Izuku could still feel the glare of the blonde on him. Katsuki couldn't find anything on Izuku. No social medias or any other news involving him. It was like he disappeared off the planet again. The a-hole goes missing, shows up 8 years later to save Katsuki's life, then disappears again. Then a little under a year later, Katsuki goes for his first day at UA. He didn't pay much attention to the extras around him. He should have. When their hobo-looking teacher showed the results, Katsuki took a glance at the extra listed under him. He froze like a deer in headlights. Right there was Izuku's name. Just chilling there like it hadn't just flipped Katsuki's world upside down. Katsuki finally paid attention to the extras around him. And there he was. Clear as day. Izuku was just standing there only a few feet away from Katsuki looking at the scores.
He was right there.
He must have seen Katsuki during the ball throw at the start, and he didn't say anything. They were childhood best friends for F's sake. Something primal exploded in Katsuki. Maybe it was rage or relief, he didn't know, but it exploded as Katsuki started charging at Izuku.
You.
What the F are you doing here? Katsuki yelled, and Izuku turned and looked at him with a questioning look of confusion and surprise. Yes, surprise beach. Unfortunately, their hobo teacher turned out to be an actually good pro and held Katsuki back. Katsuki took a second to think, even though he really wanted to blow this fucker's face off for disappearing like that. Why the F am I attacking? I need to talk to him. Asked him where the F. He's been not put him in his grave, Katsuki thought after Aizawa let him go. He kept a close eye on Izuku as they headed back. Some purple motherfucker was with him and talking to him. He even called him Aizawa. Who the F does he think he is? Izuku also had a cat with a service animal vest, the F-. After getting changed, Izuku grabbed his bag and borderline bolted out the class with purple hair in tow. Katsuki caught up to them, of course. He needed to talk to this nerd.
Oi!
He yelled from down the empty hallway, and the two figures stopped and both turned around. Purple, but had a frown and glare on his face that would probably have killed any other weakling extra. Not Katsuki, though. Izuku still had that stupid, confused expression on his face. "The F is wrong with you?" Katsuki asked, wanting to know why his friend was acting like they were complete strangers. Izuku tilted his head in visible confusion. "Do you not remember me, or something?" Katsuki asked, and Izuku only shook his head in response. "Sorry, were you from my old elementary school?" He asked, and Katsuki almost exploded as he stomped his way down the hallway until he was standing directly in front of the two fuckers with a set-off expression. "Did you seriously forget me? We were childhood friends, and then you disappear for 8 years. Now you show up out of thin air, when I thought you were dead, and act like we're total strangers." Katsuki yelled, and when he finished, Izuku's eyes widened to comedic size in complete shock. Purple-haired BSDRD looked very confused but also very aggressive, and so did the cat on Izuku's shoulder. "I knew you before?" Izuku asked, and Katsuki nodded. Then the surprise and shock was replaced by a sad smile. "I'm sorry I forgot you. I sort of blocked out a lot of stuff from before I was found."
Were
we really friends?" Izuku said while looking down at the floor. Just then a rouge thought of realization hit Katsuki like a train. "I'm an idiot," Katsuki thought. Of course, he would have been focusing on not dying when in a Quirk fight ring, not the next time he would hang out with my stupid butt. Katsuki at that moment wanted to punch himself in the face for how idiotic he was being. Finally, after a brief pause, Katsuki answered. "Yeah, we were," he said, and it looked like Izuku was about to say something else, but he was cut off by the sudden appearance of Aizawa. "You three, what are you still doing here?" the tired hobo-looking teacher asked as he approached them. "I think having a civil conversation, but I'm not sure," purple-haired BSDRD said, still as confused as before. "Well, we're heading home now. Bakugo, you should do the same," Aizawa said, and Katsuki just nodded. "He'll talk to Izuku tomorrow, and this time the fucker better not just disappear." "So, did you really see potential in everyone?" Izuku asked when they got home. "Well, none of them were a zero, but some seem troubling that I need to keep an eye on, like that Bakugo. Why did he suddenly go to attack you? What did you guys talk about in the hallway?" Shoyuta asked from the kitchen as he was making some sandwiches. "He said he knew me from before I got abducted and seemed genuinely upset when I forgot him. I feel kind of bad for him since he said we were friends, but I can't particularly remember to when I was younger apart from my mom," Izuku explained while rubbing the back of his neck. Hitoshi sighed from next to him on the couch, still dealing with that mental block. He asked, and Izuku placed caramel on his lap, making it so he couldn't move. "Yes, you know I can't help it." The sandwiches arrived shortly, and Hitoshi was pained with the choice of letting the cute cat sit in him, or make them move so he could eat. He chose cuteness and starvation. Izuku and Hitoshi hung out a bit more before Hitoshi got a call to come home for dinner, so he left. After Hitoshi left, Izuku had dinner himself before going into his room, but even though he tried his best, he couldn't sleep. His mind was too full thinking of all the events of today. Did I really know this Bakugo? Why can't I remember? Izuku thought to himself, even though he knew perfectly well why he couldn't remember. Izuku had a mental block. He had blocked out anything from before he was rescued, or at least he tried. It was always a failure to block it out in the end, since he would always remember, always have nightmares, and the scars on him would be eternal reminders. All of the attempts of blocking out the past never worked for the bad stuff because of this, but it seemed to have unfortunately worked for anything that was before he had been abducted that wasn't his mother, and even memories of her were vivid. Every time he tried thinking back to when he was younger, before he had been rescued, he would always end up thinking of the fighting. It dominated his thoughts and made him subconsciously push away any memories before it. How pathetic. He should be happy now, right? He had been living an amazing life with his dad and best friends for almost 5 years now. And then, that's another thought that swirled in his mind, that he tried to suppress, but ultimately couldn't. Where was Himiko? The first person he had met besides his dad, uncle, and aunt. Where had she gone? Why did she run away in the first place? And another third question lingered, but Izuku didn't want to ask it. Why had she killed someone? Izuku would definitely forgive Himiko for it. He was no better, he had killed. Everyone had forgiven him. What was the difference with Himiko? Izuku just wanted her back, even if she had taken someone's life. It didn't matter. He wanted his best friend back. Izuku didn't got to sleep that night. Too plagued by thoughts of why he couldn't remember his old life, where Himiko was and how he was being selfish. He was supposed to be happy and move on. Dwelling on the past isn't going to bring those people he killed back. Why was he still even thinking about it? Having nightmares that seemed to get worse every passing day that he still hadn't told anyone about. Why couldn't he just forget? But that thought scared Izuku more than anything. He had forgotten his life before being abducted so easily. He didn't want to forget. In a way, it was a self-given punishment. To never forget how he would always be a monster at heart. But also if he forgot what happened, then all those people he would have killed would also be forgotten. The villains couldn't care less about their entertainment. Those people after being killed were just probably disposed of in a ditch somewhere. They were probably still listed as missing because no one knew they were actually dead. But Izuku knew. Izuku was the only one who knew and cared. If he forgot, it would be like erasing those people from existence, and he couldn't ever forgive himself for that. So he lived with the pain. Every single
day.
And he would never tell anyone. He loved and trusted his friends and family, but they would worry. They would only make him feel worse about him keeping all this on his mind. So for everyone's sake, Izuku just had to deal with
it.
Caramel sat at the foot of his bed, obviously concerned with Izuku not sleeping, instead tossing and turning as the thoughts swirled in his head. At some point, Izuku had subconsciously transformed into his dragon form to be a bit more comfortable to sleep. He always transformed in his sleep, so maybe being transformed would help him sleep, but not luck there. At least he didn't have to deal with nightmares tonight. Unsurprisingly, Izuku didn't sleep that night. He became very lost in his thoughts and somehow managed to avoid having a panic attack thanks to Caramel. Before he knew it, the sun had risen, and his alarm went off that signaled it was time to start getting ready. He could already hear Shoyuta probably cooking breakfast in the kitchen. Now, Izuku very much underestimated the black circles under his eyes from staying up all night. Shoyuta immediately noticed them and asked how well he slept. Izuku lied through his teeth, saying he didn't sleep that well, even though he actually didn't sleep at all. The morning routine went as normal except for the fact Izuku was going to UA. When Izuku arrived at the school, his fatigue and lack of sleep was starting to catch up to him with a vengeance, so he took a quick power nap in the teacher's lounge before the bell rung, and Izuku was once again basically dragged to the class by Shoyuta. The day was a pretty normal school day with normal high school class, but then in the afternoon they had hero class, which was the only thing particularly different about UA from other high schools. Izuku sat excited for the lesson and was very excited to have All Might teaching the class. He knew about All Might and his condition since he was allowed in the staff-only areas of a school, and it made it easier since he was probably going to find out on accident anyway. Even then, he had never actually met All Might yet and was definitely stunned when he came through the door. Today we will be doing battle training, All Might said, and what little good mood Izuku had immediately evaporated as he pet Caramel, who was sitting on his desk, to calm himself. Izuku never ever wanted to use his quirk against someone, but this was the hero course, and he needed to be able to fight with it if he were to be a hero. But the thought of having to face his unprepared classmates. He had maybe 10 times their experience in a fight, and he did not like the idea of accidentally breaking their spine when throwing them against a wall. Izuku was so deep in thought, he hadn't even noticed everyone got their costumes and started leaving to get change, and he was startled back to life by Hitoshi placing a hand on his shoulder. I know you're probably a little uncomfortable with battle training, but don't worry, I'll be here, he reassured, and Izuku gave him a shaky smile before getting his costume and heading towards the locker room. Yesterday, Izuku had changed into his PE uniform in the bathroom, but he couldn't just avoid his class forever, and his nerves being on high alert thanks to the lack of sleep made him forget exactly why he was uncomfortable changing with everyone else. When Izuku had taken his shirt off to put his costume on, there was an audible gasp from the rest of his classmates behind him, and Izuku turned to see them looking worried and horrified at Izuku's scars. He had scars all of his back and chest and arms, and a few even trailed up his neck, but they were more subtle, so people didn't tend to notice when Izuku wore something that exposed his whole neck. This was one of the reasons Izuku didn't like short-sleeve shirts.
Dude.
Are you okay? One of his classmates with spiky red hair asked in the silence, and Izuku didn't notice at the time, but Bakugo was staring at Izuku with a certain larger level of shock and horror than the rest. Izuku just gave his concerned classmates a weak and sad smile. Don't worry, things are better now, he said, and another person with a tape Quirk asked, Do they still hurt? Izuku shook his head. Sometimes I might get phantom pains, but apart from that they are completely numb, Izuku said a little too casually considering what he was referring to. Hitoshi gave Izuku a worried look, because in all these 5 years of knowing each other this was the first he also saw any of Izuku's scars that went past his arms. Izuku just turned back around and continued putting his costume on to get out of there as soon as possible. He actually finished first, left the locker room, and found Caramel waiting outside because she was a very polite cat and knew not to walk into bathrooms or changing rooms, especially ones that didn't align with her SEC or species. They waited for Hitoshi, and soon everyone came out with Hitoshi trailing behind as one of the last. Izuku admired everyone else's costumes as they walked towards the training grounds. Compared to theirs, Izuku's was pretty simple. A dark green jumpsuit suited for running, climbing, rolling through the dirt that were the usual activities for the active green bean. He had red boots with metal soles. There were small openable parts of his costume on the back in the areas where his wings or tail may come out if he only semi-transformed instead of full. He had elbow padding and fingerless black gloves, so he could use his claws if he semi-transformed. He had a black mask with a dark green outline on his face, and unfortunately it covered his freckles, which Himiko had been furious about when he showed her the design. Izuku pushed that thought of his friend away quickly. Caramel sat atop his head in his messy curly hair proudly, and soon everyone was gathered at the fake city for the training. All might explain the exercise, and some people asked some questions. Soon the lots were drawn, and then Izuku nearly died inside. First teams to fight. Villains, Team B, Izuku Midoriya and Ochako Uraraka. Versus Heroes, Team D, Katsuki Bakugo and Tenya Ida. Oh, this day was going to be the death of Izuku. Uraraka came up to him and quickly dragged him away to the building as All Might took everyone else to the observation room. Okay, we need to come up with a strategy, Uraraka said as they stood in the bomb room. Well, we already know Ida and Bakugo's quirks, but they also know ours, so we are on equal standing there. We could do a surprise attack, but they would be on guard and expecting that. Izuku started mumbling to himself, and only stopped when he finally noticed Uraraka staring at him in awe. Oh, sorry. I ramble sometimes, Izuku said, rubbing the back of his neck. Uraraka shook her head. No need to apologize. You just seem really shy before, and now you're actually in the exercise. You went all serious, though the image was a little downplayed by the cat on your head, Uraraka said and pointed up at Caramel, who was now lightly dozing in Izuku's curls. But I think I might have an idea for a strategy, she exclaimed, and Izuku nodded furiously to listen. Well, I could stay up here and guard the bomb while you go down there and fight them. You're way strong, so it should be easy, and you can have Caramel run around corners and stuff to confuse them before showing yourself, Uraraka said with a huge smile growing on her face the more she seemed to think about it. Izuku just froze. Yes, Izuku's quirk was very strong, but that was the problem. For those 4 years of Izuku's life, he had instincts of never holding back in a fight drilled into him, and since he never used his quirk after those years before the exam happened, he was still afraid of those instincts coming back with a vengeance, and he already had proof that could happen from the incident in elementary. He shook his head after the memories of the teachers and students talking about how the bullies had needed to go to the hospital flashed in his head, and that incident didn't even involve the flames he could breathe, so it could have been a lot worse. That does sound like an amazing strategy, but I'm sorry, I just can't be put in that position. Not yet anyway. I have a certain lack of controlling my strength. Even in only my semi-transformed form, my strength and speed have boosted quite a bit, and I don't want to hurt someone worse than intended, Izuku explained, and Uraraka nodded. How about this? You can go down there and make them weightless. Ida's quirk is basically useless in that setting, and while Bakugo could propel himself with explosions, he seems a bit too violent with them, so he might just crash into a wall. I'll stay here and guard the bomb by blocking the entrance in my other form. Not even those explosions can get through my scales. If you want, I can send Caramel with you, so you can do the confusion thing you were talking about. Izuku said, and Uraraka nodded with determination. They were notified by All Might that time was up and that they would start now. Izuku took Caramel's vest off and handed her to Uraraka, who she immediately took to as she sat on her shoulder. Uraraka soon left, and Izuku turned into his dragon form. It was quite big, so frankly, he wouldn't have been able to fit through those narrow corridors. He laid down in front of the double doors but kept on high alert for any noises as he sat, like a dragon guarding his hoard. Quite literally. Glasses was rambling about something. Katsuki didn't care. He needed to see what Izuku could do. Izuku had a very powerful transformation quirk, so Katsuki guessed that they might have sent him down, but the corridors seemed a little narrow for Izuku's dragon form to move through easily. Didn't Izuku have an in-between? Yeah, Katsuki remembers. Yesterday Izuku didn't transform, but he could see his skin had some green scales scattered across it, and his pupils were slits like a cat, and his ears slightly more pointed. Maybe he'd use that? Then they heard the pitter-patter of feet.
Cat feet.
Izuku's service animal was going to give him away? Really? It came from behind them, so Glasses and Katsuki turned around instantly ready to block any attacks that came. But none did.
No.
Instead, they heard something rushing towards them from behind. It was a trick. They couldn't turn around in time, as Round Face slapped both their backs like they had personally offended her. No, Izuku.
Huh.
Glasses immediately tried to run but found himself with no draft and just ended up crashing into a wall.
Right.
Her quirk was zero gravity. Katsuki sent any explosion behind him to propel him forward and reacted out his other hand, getting another explosion ready for Round Face, but he unfortunately miscalculated exactly how it was having no gravity, and she just sidestepped him as he flew past her at high speed and crashed into the same wall as Glasses did. Speaking of Glasses, he seemed to be recovering, if barely, and tried to jump off the wall to get at Round Face, but she again dodged. Midoriya was right. This is a better strategy, Round Face said as she watched Glasses crash into another wall. So this was Izuku's idea. Katsuki then realized something and got a sheet-eating grin on his face. Round Face didn't see it. She was too busy easily dodging Glasses, and that ended up being the perfect distraction. Katsuki got ready as well as he could, being weightless, and then he set off a series of explosions that propelled him past Round Face and down the corridor. He made sure to jump and land on walls instead of crashing into them, and soon made his way up to the third floor as he had checked everything on the first and second floors. He wished he could have seen the shock on Round Face's face, but there was no time for that sheet. He was going to find Izuku and that bomb and win this stupid exercise. Finally, he hit some double doors, and instead of opened easily like all the others had, there was resistance that sent Katsuki flying back. Bingo! Izuku had just been vibing when his earpiece turned on. Midoriya. I'm sorry, but Bakugo managed to get away even with zero gravity affecting him. I think he's heading towards you, Uraraka said, and Izuku suddenly became alert. Right on K, Izuku heard explosions coming from the hallway that was behind the doors. He heard them get louder as they approached, and then suddenly something hit the doors harshly. It surprisingly managed to actually move Izuku a bit, but not by much, as his dragon form was just a blockade of muscle. Uraraka, cancel your quirk since Bakugo is using it to get more speed and strength, but be sure to hit Ito with it immediately, okay? Izuku said, and Uraraka made a sound of agreement. Now Izuku was prepared for Bakugo to try blowing up the doors, only to be met with hard fireproof scales, and he would not be able to budge the large muscular dragon out of the way, but what Izuku wasn't expecting was the wall next to the door to suddenly explode into a million pieces. Oh yeah, explosions. Walls are weak to those, Izuku thought as Bakugo came barreling through. Izuku! He yelled and immediately went for the offensive, and he didn't even seem the slightest bit bothered by the thought that he was facing a dragon twice his size that had explosion-proof armor for skin. Izuku immediately stood up and managed to defend against the explosion with his tail. Okay, focus. But don't focus too much. Because you might hurt him by accident, but you can't underestimate him, so focus. Izuku's thoughts did not like being put into this situation even if his demeanor and face showed none of it. It just showed an eerie calm, and his movements were fluid and perfect as he defended from Bakugo's onslaught of explosions. He positioned himself between Bakugo and the bomb because that was still his main priority. Bakugo didn't seem amused by the fact Izuku kept Kane effortlessly tanking all his explosions. He stopped and back up for a second seemingly to take a breather and try to think of a way around Izuku. Izuku took his chance and quickly swiped his tail under Bakugo's feet, making him fall flat on his butt harshly. Izuku was going to strike now and force Bakugo on the defensive, but there was hesitation. He can't just swipe at him with his bear-like claws. That would definitely end terribly. If he used his tail to send him into a wall, he could break his spine accidentally. Fire was probably ineffective against him in this situation. It would just be a waste of energy. Izuku's mind was running a mile a second. It seemed that 1 second of hesitation was enough for Bakugo as he quickly jumped back onto his feet and launched himself at a currently ill-prepared Izuku. Obviously, it didn't do any damage, but Izuku had practically frozen. Now all confidence he had before evaporated, and he was just a wall at this point, just taking Bakugo's explosions one after another. When was the time going to run out? After a bit, Bakugo managed to find a way and squirmed past Izuku. Now Izuku was paying attention and quickly gave him a whack back to the doors with his tail. Maybe it was too hard as Bakugo went borderline flying back through the doors, and Izuku heard a hard crash, which indicated Bakugo had hit a wall very hard. There was a silence for a second, and then his earpiece turned on. Young Midoriya dash. Izuku heard All Might say, but he was quickly cut off by the angry shouts of one Bakugo Katsuki as he came running back down the hall towards Izuku. He was holding his arm up and pulled something on it, a trigger? Then Izuku watched in his shock and stillness as a huge explosion started erupting from Bakugo's gauntlet. Oh shit! Izuku only had time to shield himself with his wings before the explosion hit him hard. Again there was a moment of silence. Izuku had hit his back against something.
The bomb? Probably.
Izuku opened his eyes slowly. When had he closed them? He could feel his breaths were slightly ragged and shallow as he coughed on the smoke and dust in the air. He just stayed there for a second, letting the smoke clear. He just stayed there lying on his side. Both his sides felt terrible. The one he was laying on had the landing impact, so the damage probably went through his scales, and if Izuku guessed, he would probably have a bad bruise even in his normal form. Then the other side was just a light pain, probably so light, because he was in shock. The brute force plus the heat from the explosion basically cut through his scales as he knew he would have at least a light burn on his side. Just the equivalent of a sunburn. His wing was basically demolished, so no flying in this form for a little while. It would heal. It always had before. Then there was the bleeding scratches from smaller pieces of concrete and rock that had hit him in the small gaps between his scales. Finally, as the cherry on top, Izuku had a huge headache. He would have loved nothing more than to just pass out right there, but something was screaming at him not to do that. Probably just his old bad experiences with doing that in matches. Now the smoke and dust cleared, and Izuku could very much see the shock and fear on Bakugo's. Obviously, he had been under the impression Izuku could tank it like all his other hits, or at least that it wouldn't have gone down as badly as this. Luckily, all his organs were fine thanks to his scales, and you would only be able to see the bleeding scratches in between scales if you looked closely enough, so all Izuku had to do now was stand up and walk it off like it was nothing, so that no one would worry. He tried doing that, but unfortunately his front legs betrayed him, and he just decided that maybe he was straining himself a bit. In a small puff of smoke, the dragon disappeared, and what was left was just a teenager whose hero costume was perfectly fine even though he had countless scratches and bruising under it now. Izuku managed to push the pain away like he had 100 times before and stood upright even if his legs were begging him to stop. He looked over at the still frozen Bakugo, and only now did Izuku realize how dead quiet it was. Then the sound of a buzzer seemed to go off, and the shaky and surprised voice of All Might came through the speaker. "Villain's team wins," he said, but it was obvious from the falter in his voice that he was concerned about what just happened. Izuku stretched even though he really shouldn't be, but it gave the appearance he was alright, so he did anyway even though his body protested. Then just went and walked past the statue, like Bakugo. "Good fight," was all Izuku said before he left down the corridor. Bakugo wasn't dead, so Izuku considered it a win.
What?
The F dash. Katsuki did not realize his attack would land so badly onto Izuku. Up until that point, Izuku just tanked everything and even seemed to lose interest in even attempting to defend himself at one point, which really set Katsuki off. He wasn't taking it seriously. So Katsuki pulled out the big guns, but he did not expect to see what he saw when the smoke cleared. Instead of Izuku standing tall, or maybe crouching a little, he saw Izuku full-on laying on his side with what looked like shallow breaths. Then he tried to get up and failed before he switched back to his normal form. Katsuki was absolutely terrified. He had seriously hurt Izuku, but then Izuku just stood up and stretched like nothing happened, and after his team was declared the winners, he just walked past Katsuki without a second glance. Good fight. That's all he said after it looked like he was FING dead in the floor. Jesus. Izuku seemed to be in a league all of his own, and Katsuki couldn't help but feel bad. I need to catch up to him, was all he thought as he turned around and also started walking out the building. Izuku managed to resist the urge to limp or pass out and made his way with Uraraka, Ida, and a very silent Bakugo to the observation room. Immediately, as they walked in, all their classmates exploded into conversation, and they were especially surrounding Izuku. Wow, you just took that explosion and stood up like nothing happened. So manly, Kirishima said. That plan seemed quite impressive and would be a surprise to your opponent who were expecting the more brute force of the two to fight in the front lines, Yaoyorozu said. Like seriously, everyone panicked when you were on the ground, but then you just brushed it off. Kaminari said, and many similar observations and compliments were thrown around. Not only to Izuku but also to Uraraka, Bakugo, and Ida. Soon, All Might quieted them down to the relief of Izuku. Now, can someone please tell me why the villain team won? All Might asked, and Yaoyorozu raised her hand. Because they had an efficient strategy that wasn't expected, and were able to keep the heroes from the bomb by acting as blockades. This can especially be seen with Midoriya. Uraraka used her quirk to disorient and make battling harder for the enemy. You can also see they were communicating and working together, while Bakugo and Ida didn't particularly try to get feedback from the other on what to do. She said, and Izuku just really wanted to lay down as the cuts and bruises were starting to hurt now that adrenaline and shock wore off. Very good, young Yaoyorozu. All Might praised, and Yaoyorozu also went off on a tangent about their individual strengths and weakness, but Izuku just started to tune her out and focused on Caramel. She had been held by Uraraka all the way here, but now she retook her place on Izuku's shoulder, and he carefully put her vest back on. Then her little pink nose scrunched up, and she gave Izuku a mix of a really and a worried look. She could probably smell the blood from Izuku's cuts, and he decided that this would be a good time to head to Recovery Girl before Caramel fetches her herself. Izuku tuned back into the conversation to tell them he needed to go see Recovery Girl. Hey, All Might, is it okay if I go see Recovery Girl just in case I did get any injuries? Izuku said, completely ignoring the fact he did have injuries. All Might nodded, and Izuku headed off but found himself being joined by Bakugo. I crashed into a bunch off walls. Gotta make sure I didn't FING break something from when you catapulted me down a hallway, was all Bakugo said, and Izuku resisted the urge to flinch at that comment. The walk to Recovery Girl's office was silent and uncomfortable for Izuku. Bakugo seemed much more content though, as he just walked along with a blank face without making a sound. Finally they got there, and Recovery Girl first looked over Bakugo, which he had some bruises on his arm, but apart from that was fine, and he got healed up quickly and given some gummies. Then she looked over Izuku and had an audible gasp at the bruising, cuts, and scratches. She scolded him real quick before mumbling about how he shouldn't have even been able to walk there without almost collapsing, but Izuku just shrugged. He's had worse. He also suspected the gasp came from all the scars, but she didn't say anything about it. Luckily, since Izuku literally just stayed in one spot for the whole exercise, he had plenty of stamina to spare for Recovery Girl's quirk. He didn't notice how Bakugo's eyes widened to comedic proportions when he saw the amount of damage Izuku had actually taken. Afterwards, he got gummies too, and Caramel was being as comforting as always. Soon Izuku returned to the observation room with Bakugo to watch his classmates' fights. Bakugo had been very silent on the way back, and that greatly uneased Izuku. Hitoshi fussed over him a little now that there wasn't a crowd surrounding him, but Izuku ensured he was okay. Finally, by the end of the day, Izuku's fatigue was catching up with him. Using his stamina to heal, and then also not having slept the night before had made him very tired, and Caramel seemed to share that thought as she yawned loudly while on his shoulder after he finished changing. Hitoshi, Shoyuta, and Caramel all walked out the school together, all exhausted. Hitoshi spotted Bakugo ahead of them, and it seemed he wanted to say something to Izuku, but stopped when he stopped their teacher, and he just turned around and left. They dropped Hitoshi off at his home before heading home themselves, and Izuku immediately crashed on his bed extremely tired. Caramel curled up on his head, and he just fell into sleep. Unsurprisingly, he woke up at 2 a.m. from a nightmare. This one was surprisingly different as it was about him accidentally breaking Bakugo's spine in the training exercise, but Izuku didn't dwell on it as the blurry remnants of his dream disappeared as he stretched like a cat in his dragon form, and then he accidentally knocked a book off his desk with his tail. He really needed to talk to Shoyuta about a bigger room, or else he would fall onto the floor in his sleep. Luckily, the book didn't wake Shoyuta, and Izuku just snuck out of the window quietly and flew to the roof. He had found that going to the roof was a nice, quiet place to calm down when he had a nightmare. He stayed up there for maybe an hour just looking at the night sky, and also at the city full of lights, even though most were asleep. The cold wind was soothing, and the silence of street down below, which would in the day be filled with cars, was nice. The moon shined brightly, and the night sky was clear of any pesky clouds. Many stars littered the sky, some shining brighter than others. Finally, Izuku saw how the moon was starting to hang low in the sky, and so he retreated back to his room through his window. Caramel waiting for him, and he was thankfully calm enough to go back to sleep. The next thing Izuku knew after he closed his eyes for a moment was the ringing of his alarm, and he cracked his eyes open the tiniest bit to find his room filled with light. He closed his alarm and poofed back to his normal form and just rubbed his eyes for a few minutes before getting up and leaving his room. The morning was very normal. He ate breakfast with Shoyuta in silence before starting to get ready for the day. Then he was taken to school early and thankfully didn't have to suffer the reporters which appeared later to ask about All Might. Izuku sat in the classroom silently writing in his notebook with Caramel sitting on his head and peering down at his notes every once in a while to see what he was doing even though she couldn't read. The rest of Izuku's classmates soon came in and were all complaining about the press at the front. "I bet you didn't have to deal with the press," Izuku, Hitoshi said while walking up to him. "Why is that?" Kaminari asked from where he sat on desk nearby. "I'm pretty sure Izuku comes into the school like 40 minutes early," Hitoshi answered, and Izuku just nodded as he continued going over his notebook. "How can you wake up so early?" Kaminari exclaimed at Izuku, and Izuku just shrugged. He always did have a tendency to wake up early even on weekends, probably because of his nightmares. "That's just Izuku for you," Hitoshi said, and proceeded to pet Caramel while she sat on Izuku's head. This was a normal occurrence since Hitoshi was a huge cat person, and Caramel would try to spend as much time in Izuku's messy curls as possible. But the conversation was cut short by Shoyuta, and everyone immediately sat down. "Okay, I know this is a bit sudden, but you're all going to have to choose your class representative," Shoyuta said, while looking as tired as ever. The class immediately exploded into variants of "I want to be class rep." Izuku didn't. One voice shouted out above them all though. It was Ida. He suggested that there be a vote, and pretty much everyone agreed to this, so everyone was given a small piece of paper and told to write who they voted for, and soon all papers were gathered. Izuku had voted for Ida. He seemed to be the most responsible out of everyone in the class considering his love for the rules. The votes were shown, and Izuku's jaw dropped to the floor. Midoriya Izuku, 3 votes. Yaoyorozu Momo, 2 votes. And the rest had one apart from a select few. Everyone started loudly congratulating Izuku, and Caramel was sensing how tense he was. The bell rang, and they went out for break. Izuku got his food quickly and sat down but was soon joined by Uraraka, Ida, and of course Satoshi. "Congrats on being our new class rep," Uraraka said happily, and Izuku just rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Caramel was being as encouraging as ever while burying herself in his curls. "You know, Izuku, you can always refuse the position of class rep," Hitoshi said, which apparently caught Ida and Uraraka off guard. "What?" Ida exclaimed. "I thought you were friends with Midoriya." Why would you try to discourage him from such an amazing thing? Ida said while waving his hands around frantically. Hitoshi shook his head. No, I'm not trying to discourage him. I know Izuku, and I know he probably doesn't even want to be class rep. That's why I voted for Yaoyorozu, Hitoshi explained, but they didn't seem convinced, so Izuku piped up. Hitoshi is right. I don't want to be class rep, Izuku said, and the dumbfounded stares of Uraraka and Ida made him look away with a little shame. But why? This is a great chance to show your leadership skills and stand out, Ida asked, and Uraraka nodded along. Well, I'm just not very confident in my skills. It's a big responsibility, and I already have a generally packed schedule since I need to train more with my quirk because I've been neglecting it. I feel as if there are others that would do much better at this role. That's why I voted for you, Ida. Izuku explained, and Ida went back to having a look of dumbfounded shock.
You
voted for me? Ida asked, and Izuku nodded. There was brief silence where Izuku was afraid he had said something wrong, but then Ida had a bright smile. Thank you, Midoriya. I'm sorry you wasted your vote on me, but I'm honored to know you think of me in such high regard, Ida said, and Izuku smiled back. Soon the table of four drifted into other topics of conversation. Izuku fanboyed a little at finding out Ida's brother was Ingenium, and Hitoshi attempted to try and tease Izuku about something, but it backfired when Izuku told the story of when Hitoshi climbed up a tree and onto a thin branch despite the warnings and discouragement of Himiko and Izuku. Unsurprisingly, the branch had broken, and he fell hard onto the ground. Uraraka wanted more stories, and so the two eagerly recounted many funny stories of their terrible trio hanging out together. Then suddenly an alarm started blaring. Everyone was frozen in shock for a second before everyone got up to leave. All the students that had been in the cafeteria rushed for the exit, and it ended bringing a huge mess and stampede. At one point, Izuku lost Hitoshi and the others on the crowd, and he was trying to make sure Caramel wasn't going to get swept away as well as she desperately held onto his hair. Everyone was pushing and shoving, and Izuku did not like it one bit. He couldn't find his friends. Some people were even trying to use their quirks to get past everyone, which was just making more chaos. The shouting, the shoving, and pushing, it was all overwhelming Izuku. It reminded him of that place, how the crowd would shout and cheer so loudly, and how if he tried to escape, he would be shoved back into the fight harshly by someone with a strength quirk. It was terrible and terrifying, and Izuku was expecting to be attacked any minute. He couldn't handle this. He couldn't handle this. He couldn't. Izuku was stuck in this terrible limbo of desperately trying to convince himself he was okay and not there while his mind screamed at him to transform and attack everyone currently daring to break his personal bubble. He was so lost in his own head that he didn't notice when Ida had gotten everyone's attention and said about the press. He didn't notice when the shouting started calming down into muttering, and he didn't notice when the crowd surrounding him finally stopped frantically pushing him in all directions. What finally snapped him out of his panic state was a firm hand coming down on his shoulder. At first, he wanted to transform and defend himself against whoever was having the nerve to attack him right now, but then a familiar voice came. Oi, Izuku, can you hear me? Stop panicking and focus on my voice. Bakugo's voice rang out, and it grounded Izuku. After a few more seconds of trying to calm his heart rate, he opened his eyes. When had he closed them? He opened his eyes and realized that he was also holding his head. Had he been hyperventilating? His breaths were still shallow, but they started to even out. The crowd was slowly dispersing back to the cafeteria around him. Izuku lowered his arms until they fell to his side, and he just focused on breathing normally for the next few seconds. He didn't even register that Bakugo was still there with his hand on his shoulder and looking at him with worry. What he did register after a moment was Hitoshi. Hitoshi was coming towards him. Izuku, are you okay? Hitoshi asked with mountains of worry on his face. Izuku only now realized he had been crying silent tears. Izuku never sobbed loudly. It was something that was ingrained in him from back then. He slowly nodded while wiping away the tears as they finally stopped. Hitoshi and Bakugo led him to a table to sit down and calm properly. After a few more minutes, Izuku was fully calm, and Caramel was curled up on his lap. At one point, Uraraka and Ida had shown up. Izuku wasn't sure when. Izuku, have you calmed down? Hitoshi asked. Why, yeah. Izuku said while petting Caramel. That was stressful. Soon break ended, and they all headed back to the classroom. Izuku dreaded having to go up to the front of the class, but Ida told him he would do it. Ida quickly announced how Izuku did not wish to be class representative, and everyone looked at Izuku with confusion but acceptance when he explained why. They took a revote, and it ended up with Ida winning, but Yaoyorozu came second again. Finally, the day soon finished, and Izuku got to go home and crash on his bed. He was very emotionally drained from what happened, so he just really needed a rest, and Shoyuta seemed to share that sentiment. Izuku, unfortunately, had to get up to do his homework. After he finished it, sleep was calling his name, but he wasn't out of the woods yet as Hitoshi texted him. Let me sleep. Hey, are you doing okay? Caramel is cute. Tired, but apart from that I'm good. Why? Let me sleep. I don't know, maybe because you had a panic attack today. If you need to talk, I'm here, you know. Caramel is cute. Yes, you've reminded me every day for the last 5 years. Like I said, I'm just tired, and it wasn't like I was expecting to almost get trampled today, so can you blame me for having a panic attack? Let me sleep. You seem more tense the last few days. I thought going to UA would have cheered you up. I know. Tomorrow let's go hang out after school. We can take the train to that forest you so love. Caramel is cute, me? Loving nature? Get out of town. But yeah, that sounds good. I'm pretty tired, so see you tomorrow. Izuku put his phone down, expecting that to be the end of it. He left his room and started getting ready for bed. When he returned from brushing his teeth, he saw that Hitoshi had sent him another message. It was a cat meme. Izuku and Hitoshi proceeded to send each other memes for the next 2 hours or so. Sometimes it was cat memes, and sometimes it was just generally relatable memes. Izuku slightly panicked when he saw what time it was. It wasn't that late, but the fact that he and Hitoshi had just been sending memes back and forth for 2 hours was a little baffling, especially since the time seemed to fly by. Also, Izuku suspected that Shoyuta thought he was going insane since he had been loudly giggling at the funny memes for 2 hours straight. Finally, Izuku retired to sleep and was ready to face the next day head-on. Little did he know of the chaos that was coming. Izuku woke up late that morning, and Shoyuta watched with amusement as he sped around the apartment before finally being ready and standing at the door with Shoyuta. You got everything, champ? Shoyuta said while trying to hide his laughter. This earned him a punch to the shoulder. They got to school, and the day was average. They had their classes, and nothing much happened, which Izuku was thankful for, but he couldn't help this feeling. Izuku always had a strange way to tell if danger was near, probably because he used to be in a lot of it. There was something off about today, but Izuku couldn't place his finger on it. Their hero lesson was apparently taking place a little bit away from the main area of the campus, and Shoyuta said they would have 3 teachers, so Izuku was excited to see who it would be, even though he already knew every teacher. Ida coordinated them onto the bus, and Izuku ended up sitting next to Azui and Kaminari. Midoriya, just a warning, I can be a bit blunt at times, Azui said, and Izuku nodded. Alright, well, why do you seem to hate your quirk? She asked, and Izuku regretted all his life decisions right then and there. He rubbed the back of his neck nervously. Well, why would you think that? Izuku asked nervously. He didn't recall telling anyone in his new class about his distaste for his quirk. Well, you seem to use it really sparingly. The only time you've used it is when specifically instructed, and even then you haven't really gone all out, it seems. Especially during the fighting exercise, you were really hesitant to do anything with your quirk and instead sent Uraraka to do a lot of the upfront fighting. It's just people with strong quirks usually have this confidence to them, Azui expertly analyzed. Izuku had to admit she was good with picking up on little details like that. Yeah, think of Bakugo as an example. He has the personality of a flaming pile of garbage. Kaminari said from next to him, and Bakugo seemed to protest that statement as he started yelling at Kaminari. Kaminari just pointed at him and went see. Izuku managed to kill the laugh that was coming up his throat as more classmates joined in on the teasing. Then Kirishima spoke up. Are you sure about all that? I mean, why would someone hate a great flashy quirk like that? My quirk's good for defense, but it's not flashy, so I probably won't get noticed as much as someone like Midoriya, Kirishima said, and Izuku shook his head. No, Kirishima, your quirk is good for defense but also offense since it lets you get in close. Anyone with half a functioning brain can see that your quirk is great for heroics, and if you're worried about being flashy and standing out, it's obvious you take care of your image, so I don't think you'll have a problem with that, Izuku said, and only now did he realize everyone's attention was back on him. Kirishima looked moved to tears. You really think so? He asked, and Izuku nodded. I agree with what Midoriya said, and can you all call me Tsu? Tsu said, and after Izuku heard that he remembered something, oh yeah, you can all call me Izuku. I prefer it over Midoriya, he said. Soon they finally reached their destination. They all filed out of the bus and entered the facility. Many were amazed by the almost theme park-looking place they found themselves, and Izuku could now guess who the third teacher would be and what lesson they were doing. Maybe that feeling was just that, a feeling. Nothing can go wrong when it's rescue training. As Izuku guessed, it was 13. Caramel shifted, so she was on Izuku's shoulder instead of where she had been nested on his head. Shoyuta asked where All Might was, and 13 whispered something to him and showed 3 fingers, which Izuku guessed it meant he had exceeded his time limit for the day. Soon everyone settled down and 13 started explaining how all quirks could be dangerous, but Izuku's attention was drawn to this overwhelming feeling of dread. It was unbearable, and then that's when Izuku noticed it, a small inky black in front of the fountain. Izuku semi-transformed, so he could use his enhanced sight to get a better look. Then the dot started growing bigger and the lights of the facility flickered. The foundation also started malfunctioning a bit. Izuku did not like the large dark purple misty mass that appeared in front of the fountain, and he especially didn't like it when a figure stepped out of it, then another, and then a whole bunch right after the first 2. Villains. All of the alarms in Izuku's head started blaring. The villain which had come out first was covered in what looked like severed hands, and he started monologuing to himself, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. Izuku looked at Shoyuta for some sort of encouragement, but he didn't find any, as Shoyuta seemed to be getting ready to jump into fight. Has the training started already? I thought we were doing rescue, Kirishima said, and was about to take a step forward, but Izuku's outstretched arm stopped him. This isn't an exercise. These are real villains. They must be blocking the signals since the alarms aren't going off. 13, get the students out of here and call for backup while I hold them off, Shoyuta said as he readied his capture weapon. Wait, what the F are you going to do? Doesn't your quirk work better with one-on-one battles? Bakugo shouted, but Izuku answered for Shoyuta. You can't be a hero if you're a one-trick pony, Bakugo, Izuku said seriously, and Shoyuta nodded before jumping down and into the mass of villains. Everyone started going to the door. Izuku ran to be just behind 13 because he really did not want to be there. He trusted Shoyuta could handle it. Then the villain which had transported the other villains there appeared. He seemed to have a warp quirk. He told them how they were there to kill All Might and how he was going to scatter them to their dooms, which made Izuku give off a growl from his throat that sounded more like a wild animal than anything human. 13 activated their quirk, or at least they tried, but Bakugo and Kirishima jumped in the way. They didn't do any damage, unsurprisingly, and then Izuku panicked as the mist spread around them and he couldn't see anything. Then he was falling. He was falling. Before Izuku could react, he hit the water. Something was coming towards him, something at high speeds. A villain. Izuku positioned himself so he would claw at the shark villain that was coming at him, but he never got the chance as Tsu pushed the villain away before grabbing Izuku with her tongue and throwing him onto the ship. They were in the shipwreck zone. Hitoshi soon followed, and Tsu climbed up Thre's side of the boat. Okay, well, I guess we have to deal with this sheet now, Hitoshi said after a moment of silence. Izuku was strangely calm considering the situation. Maybe it was because the reality hadn't set in yet, but Izuku's mind wandered away from the present like it had better things to do than try and stay alive. Then Izuku noticed his fluffy companion wasn't with him, and he started panicking slightly and looking around for Caramel. Hitoshi thankfully took charge. All right, we're still in the USJ, it seems. Hitoshi peered over the edge and then almost immediately recoiled. Okay, swimming is not an option since there are a bunch of villains down there, he said, and Izuku just panicked more at the prospect of one of them hurting Caramel, and he wasn't really paying attention. If we're still here, then maybe the rest of the class is too, just scattered, Tsu said in thought, and Hitoshi nodded along. We need to make a plan to get out of here and towards the exit, Hitoshi said, and a thought struck Izuku. They don't know our quirks. If they knew them, then they would have sent Tsu into the fire zone over there, Izuku said, and Hitoshi and Tsu both nodded in thought. Alright, I think I might have a plan as to how we are getting out of here, Hitoshi said after a moment of thought. Finally, Izuku was listening when Hitoshi told them about the prospect to escape. It was pretty simple and straightforward, but would almost definitely work. The villains seemed to be getting impatient, and one of them cut the boat in half, so it was now or never. After quick confirmation, everyone was on board. Izuku went to the railing of the boat and jumped. The villains gasped at this, probably thinking he was insane and had a death wish, but before Izuku could fall any big distance, he turned into his dragon form, which seemed to really surprise a lot of the villains. Some even shouted or screamed. Izuku didn't pay them any mind as he flew back up to the boat railing, and Tsu jumped onto him with Hitoshi in tow. Izuku faltered for a second at the extra weight. He had never carried someone while flying before, but thanks to the fact Izuku's dragon form had grown quite a lot as he got older, evidenced by the fact he needs to sleep in a double bed at night, he was able to carry them and fly semi-well. They quickly flew out of the flood zone and towards the entrance. He spotted some of their classmates, and there was an audible gasp from Hitoshi and Tsu when they saw the injured 13 on the ground. They landed there, and once the two were off Izuku's back, he swiftly went back to his semi-transformed form and ran with them towards the group. Are you guys okay? What happened? Where's that mist villain? Hitoshi asked, and Uraraka quickly explained they had gotten Ida out and thrown the villain halfway across the USJ. Hitoshi and Tsu were recounting what they had done at the flood zone, but Izuku's face scrunched up at a terrifyingly familiar smell. He walked a little bit past the group and looked down at where the smell was coming from. Iron and salt. Izuku's improved vision allowed him to see a sight he did not like one bit. The source of the strong smell of blood. Shoyuda was lying in a pool of his own as a large navy blue-skinned figure dwarfed over him. The hand villain was monologuing something, and then the mist villain appeared next to him. They exchanged a few words which Izuku could hear thanks to his enhanced hearing, but he wasn't listening. He was too focused on the beaten and bloodied figure on the floor, whose arm seemed to have been broken like a toothpick. Izuku didn't realize it, but he was hyperventilating. He heard a gasp as his classmates finally came to see what he was looking at. He felt Hitoshi put his hand on his shoulder and try getting him to breathe properly, but it wasn't working. Memories came flashing through his eyes. The smell of blood, how fragile people were when faced with brute strength. Then finally something got through this thick blanket of static noise in Izuku's head. Nomu, bring me one of the brats, so I can spell a message out for All Might with their limbs. He heard that terrible scratchy voice, and he immediately snapped out of it. He jolted upwards, which startled Hitoshi, who still had his hand on Izuku's shoulder. Then the navy blue-skinned figure that stood above Shoyuda was gone, and in less than a blink of an eye was in front of them. Izuku watched in horror as it reached down with a hand covered in Shuda's blood. It reached down towards Ishido and Siro. Izuku had a sudden adrenaline boost through his veins like he hadn't known in a long time. He immediately leaped at the villain and aimed his claws at its exposed brain. Its eyes moved unsettlingly to stare at Izuku with its blank gaze, and instantly caught him by the throat with the hand that had been reaching for Ishido and Siro. Izuku was now caught in a steel-like grip and clawed at its hand that was restricting any plentiful amount of oxygen from his lungs. He could feel it was starting to bleed from its hand, but it had no reaction. It just held Izuku above the ground effortlessly like a doll, as Izuku struggled for a bigger breath than the small trickle of oxygen he was getting. Then suddenly he was thrown. He was thrown in a frighteningly familiar way. By pure instinct, he managed to transform before he hit the ground, and thankfully his armor of scales protected him from the hard concrete floor for the most part. He tried getting up with urgency, but his head was swiftly pinned down to the hard, cold ground by that villain who got there almost as fast as Izuku had been thrown. Izuku choked again, not being allowed much breath. Well, look what we have here. I little hero, who thought he could go toe-to-toe with Nomu, the white-haired villain said in his scratchy voice as he approached. Izuku looked up at the villain and snarled while showing his rows of sharp teeth. The Nomu then proceeded to hold down his head harder against the ground, and Izuku choked a little. Now don't you see the situation you're in? You can't afford to threaten anybody with Noma threatening to break your neck, brat, the hand villain said while Izuku stared at him with hatred burning in his eyes. Tamura Shigaraki, we must leave soon. The heroes will undoubtedly be on their way, the mist villain said from behind Shigaraki, and he scratched at his neck momentarily before finally meeting Izuku's gaze. Don't take this personally, brat, but your days of fighting with those weak idiot heroes are over, he said before he crouched down and started reaching for Izuku, and it was like time was going in slow motion. Izuku started to really panic. No. It couldn't end like this. Then, just before the villain's hand made contact with Izuku's face, he stopped and turned around slightly. You really are so cool, he said, and Izuku guessed from the direction he was looking in he was talking about Shoyuta. Then the large villain that had been holding him down quickly went over to Shoyuta in a blink of an eye, or at least that's where Izuku thinks they went because he couldn't actually see Shoyuta from the angle he was lying on the ground. Then he heard it. The sound of someone's head getting bashed into the ground, so hard the ground cracked. It filled Izuku with a primal protective rage he didn't know he had anymore. In that place it was to protect himself, but now it was to protect the one person that believed in him from the first day they met and never left his side. All restraints he had on his fighting instinct were released as he moved so fast he was a blur. He skipped Shigaraki and that mist villain and went straight for the Nomu as he leaped over them. He saw how the Nomu was holding Shuta's head to the ground in his own puddle of blood. A scream escaped Izuku's throat. It wasn't human at all. It was the sound an enraged animal would make while running head first into a fight, a battle cry. It was so loud that Izuku was sure it probably echoed throughout the whole USJ. The villain craned its head up to see where that sound came from, but Izuku made sure even something as blindingly fast as it was wouldn't be able to react as Izuku leaped onto it and swiftly bit down onto its throat while digging his claws into it for leverage. An inhuman screech came from the creature as it tried to pry Izuku off with little to no avail. Izuku ensured that not even something as strong as All Might could pry him off. Then the loud noise of the doors being punched out of the way came from the entrance. Izuku didn't need to look since he could already scent who it was. Have no fear, for I am here, All Might said as he entered, and he wasn't smiling, but Izuku couldn't see that as he was too focused on making this creature suffer for daring to hurt one of his loved ones. Tashinori was an idiot. He should have known something was wrong when his colleagues didn't answer their phones. Heroes always made it a habit to answer their phones as soon as possible. Now his students had paid the price for his ignorance. As he entered the facility, he saw some of the students there in front of him. Young Shinso, Uraraka, Ajui, Shoji, Sero, and Ishido. They all surrounded an injured 13, and all of them seemed so frightened. Then Tashinori's gaze drifted down to the main plaza. Many villains were starting to get up as it seemed they had been knocked out. There was two who were already standing and both staring at Tashinori, but he couldn't make out their expression. Then there was Aizawa on the ground in a puddle of his own blood. But the thing that caught Tashinori's eye the most was the familiar dragon form of young Midoriya attacking a large villain with navy blue skin, and even from all the way up there Tashinori could feel the aura of killing intent that surrounded the young hero. He immediately sprung into action and knocked out all the villains once more before getting Aizawa, and while he attempted to get young Midoriya, he was firmly locked in place, and when Tashinori tried to get him away from the villain, he only dug his claws deeper and threatened that Tashinori would rip a part of the villain off if he pried young Midoriya off. So Tashinori only retreated with Aizawa in his arms. In less than a second, he was back at the top of the stairs and handed the injured Aizawa to the students. Get him out of here carefully, Tashinori said before going back down to the plaza and standing tall in front of the villains. Young Midoriya and the other villain were still in a struggle. The two villains were standing shocked before the one covered in hands looked back at young Midoriya. Kurogiri, distract All Might for a second while I go turn that brat into dust, the villain said before starting to run towards young Midoriya. Tashinori was about to after the villain to help his student when a dark purple mass appeared in front and behind him. When he tried to run through it, he would end up back to where the one that was behind him was. A warp. Izuku was in such a blind rage that he didn't realize when All Might tried to pry him off the villain, but he did realize when Shigaraki started running towards him with his arm outstretched. Izuku hit him with his tail when he came close enough, and that sent him flying into the water of the flood zone. Izuku then continued trying his best to put the Noma down for good, but it was no use. It just kept on regenerating every time Izuku pulled out a chunk of it. The area where they were standing and was covered in blood, all of it belonging to the Nomu. Then a loud explosion could be heard. Bakugo? While Izuku was still biting down harshly on the Nomu's throat, he was able to turn slightly to see Bakugo attack that mist villain, Kirojiri, and hold him down. Apparently the villain had been hindering All Might slightly. "Don't try and take out all the villains before me, Izuku," Bakugo yelled. Then Izuku felt a sudden cold and drop in temperature that his cold-blooded reptilianus did not enjoy. He looked to his side this time and saw the Noma half frozen, but the ice stopped just before it reached Izuku. He saw Todoroki and Kirishima there too. This is when Izuku finally started to calm a little as he noticed Shoyuta was no longer in imminent danger. He jumped off of the Nomu so that Todoroki could freeze it more, and he quickly found himself next to Kirishima and Todoroki, but he still stayed his dragon form since he couldn't let his guard down. Kirishima looked at him with shock. "Dude, you're covered in blood, are you okay?" he said, worry evident on his face. Izuku merely breathed out a small breath of fire to warm himself up since he had been a little too close to Todoroki's ice. "I'm fine. This doesn't belong to me," he said with rage still burning in his eyes, but it was more subdued now. Kirishima just nodded after glancing at the Nomu. All Might appeared next to them. "Are you three all right? Young Midoriya, what about you?" All Might asked, and they all nodded. "All Might, be careful. That villain Todoroki just got his ice on his regeneration and is super strong," Izuku said, not letting his eyes leave the Nomu for a second. Then a shout could be heard coming from the direction of the flood zone. "You brats are going to regret that." "Nomu." It was that but Shigaraki. In a second the Nomu broke free from the ice, even at the expense of its arm and leg, but it swiftly regenerated. Izuku got ready to jump back into battle, and another growl escaped his throat, but All Might stopped him. "You've done enough. Now let the adults handle this," he said. Todoroki scoffed. "It's a little late for that, don't you think?" he said, and Izuku couldn't help but agree. Then the Noma charged towards where Bakugo was holding down Kirojiri, so fast it was a blur, but in that same moment All Might moved and managed to move Bakugo out the way, but he took the blow instead. Kirojiri swiftly manifested next to Shigaraki, who had climbed out of the water now. Izuku decided to shift his focus away from the Nomu because All Might seemed to be fighting it, and he didn't want to get in the way. He turned his full attention onto Shigaraki and Kirojiri. Bakugo, Kirishima, and Todoroki did the same. Unfortunately, they couldn't fight them since the shockwaves of All Might and the Noma's fight was pushing them back too much. Izuku had to dig his claws into the ground, not to get blown away. Then finally, in a devastating final blow, All Might sent the Nomu flying out of the USJ and high into the sky. The fact that Shigaraki's plan didn't work seemed to really infuriate him. He started mumbling about cheating and scratching his neck. Then All Might decided to provoke him. Izuku knew this was an intimidation tactic, but it was kind of stupid since this villain was an unstable psycho, and All Might had obviously already reached his limit, or at least it was obvious to those who knew about his injury like Izuku and the staff. As Izuku has expected from a literal psycho, provoking him caused him to lash out, and really what was All Might expecting? Izuku was about to jump in when a mix of familiar scents crashed into him, and he stopped just before a bullet went through Shigaraki's hand. Finally, the heroes had arrived. Yue's faculty quickly took care of the remaining villains, but unfortunately Shigaraki escaped, which greatly ticked Izuku off. Cementos thankfully covered for All Might. Izuku and the others made their way up to the entrance. Izuku could have turned back to normal, but he still had his guard high up even though the heroes and ambulances were here. He didn't want to turn back just yet. Izuku sat down outside to the side so everyone else would get medical treatment before him. Apart from maybe a few bruises from the landing of being thrown by that Noma, he was fine. Soon a familiar face approached Izuku. "Hello, Izuku. I just wanted to make sure that you're all right," Nedza said as he had to look up at Izuku to meet his gaze. "You can turn back now. The villains are all dealt with. You're safe," Nedza tried to encourage, and Izuku just sighed before his dragon form disappeared in a quick puff of smoke, and he sat down on the ground in his normal form. Nedza gave him a towel to wipe the blood off, and Izuku graciously accepted. They just sat next to each other in silence for a few minutes before Izuku broke it. "Is Dad okay?" he asked, knowing full well that Nedza knew who he was talking about. "Aizawa has already been taken to the hospital. I heard what happened from Shinso. You probably saved his life," Nedza said in his usual cheery voice, his smile never faltering once. "All right, I just hope that he's going to be okay." Izuku sat there for a little while longer, until someone tapped his shoulder. He looked up and saw it was
Tokoyami.
Midoriya. "She had been transported to the hurricane zone with me," Tokoyami said, and Izuku saw who he was talking about. "Caramel," he exclaimed, and the cat jumped out of Tokoyami's arms and into Izuku's in an instant. "Thank you for bringing her back safely, Tokoyami, and you can call me Izuku," Izuku said, and Tokoyami nodded. Soon they were all told to go home as no one, apart from Shoyuta and 13, had any serious injuries. Izuku did have to go see a recovery girl, though, because of the bruise. Then finally he got to head home. Home, where everything makes perfect sense. Where Izuku could just lay down and read his books without anyone disturbing him. Where he was safe. And where Shoyuta would be. Izuku's train of thought was cut off as he opened the door and remembered that Shoyuta was in the hospital. He sighed. "It's fine, it's all right. I can have some time to rewind on my own now," Izuku thought.
When he came into the apartment, it felt so
empty. There were no sounds from the kitchen indicating Shoyuta was cooking. The TV wasn't on. Caramel was still lightly snoozing on his head, so there were no pitter-patter of little cat feet. It was so quiet and still. Nothing had been touched or changed from that morning. It was almost surreal walking into the house, perfectly preserved from this morning after they left. It was so quiet that Izuku could hear his own heartbeats and the creaks of the floorboards as he walked to the living room after taking his shoes off at the door. He sat down on the couch and just stayed there. He stayed seated in the complete silence, with nothing to do. There wasn't Shoyuta to talk to. They didn't have homework or school tomorrow, because of the whole ordeal. Izuku thought about turning the TV on, but then promptly realized it would probably be talking about the attack today, and Izuku didn't want any more reminders about that. Really, everything right now was a reminder. The stillness and silence, and how alone Izuku felt. He hadn't felt this alone since he found out Himiko went missing. Oh God, Himiko. If she had been here, she would have definitely barged in with a cake to cheer Izuku up. She would have worried and fussed and helped Izuku not feel so alone. Hitoshi couldn't do that because he had also been in the attack, so his family would probably be fussing over him right now. But Himiko didn't want to go to UA. She would have been able to kick the door down all in the hopes to make Izuku feel better. But Himiko wasn't here. She could act rash and feral at times, but she always meant well. That was just her way of showing affection. That element of feralness and constantly having some to fall back on was the thing he missed the most about Himiko. Yeah, Izuku had Hitoshi, but Hitoshi had his own set of things to deal with, especially from UA. Izuku was Hitoshi's safety net, and Himiko was Izuku's, but who was Himiko's? Did she even have someone to count on when times became rough? Now that Izuku thought about it, he had never once seen her genuinely upset. She had always been smiling and happy. That wasn't how a human was supposed to work. Was she bottling everything up? Is that why she ran away? Because it became too much to hold in anymore? Izuku was getting lost in his thoughts. The silence around him was suffocating, and he didn't even realize when Caramel started trying to comfort him. There were things Izuku was only realizing now, and he felt terrible. He felt like a terrible person for not thinking that his friend had more going on than what was shown at the surface. Izuku needed a distraction. He decided to turn the TV on. As he predicted, it was the news talking about the USJ attack. They started talking about how footage saw a villain sent flying out of the USJ, and how he was retrieved completely unharmed. Izuku shuddered when he realized which villain they were talking about, the Nomu. That thing unsettled Izuku more than anything else that happened. It didn't even seem sentient, just a soldier following commands. Then Izuku remembered how he had attacked it. How he had tried to rip its throat out without a second thought. If that thing didn't have regeneration, then what would have happened? Would Izuku have? He cut his thoughts off before they reached that dark place in the back of his mind. He couldn't think about all that. Feeling bad wasn't going to change what happened. But Izuku had almost done it again. He had almost killed someone without a second thought. He acted like a monster. Izuku shuddered as he couldn't get the thoughts out of his head. Then he was finally brought back to reality when Caramel jumped onto his lap, harshly. She looked up at him to make sure he was focused on her and not his thoughts. Izuku sighed. It's funny how trauma works, isn't it, girl? Some days are just worse than others, Izuku said as he started petting Caramel. She purred and leaned into the affection. Izuku had the subconscious need to itch at his scars, but he made sure to try and be too busy petting Caramel to do that. Izuku's phone buzzed from where he had put it on the table. He carefully got up and Caramel climbed up onto his shoulder. He picked up his phone and saw it was a message from Zashi. Screaming is my day job. Hey kid, just so you know, Shoyuta is at XXX hospital. The doctors have said that he is allowed visitors tomorrow. Caramel is cute. Thanks, Uncle Zashi.
Izuku looked at the time.
It was 4 p.m. already? Izuku must have been freaking out for a while, or maybe he was just petting Caramel for a while. He hoped it was the latter. He turned the TV off before getting changed into something more casual and going out for a walk. That sounded like just what he needed to calm down. Caramel was nested in his hair, as usual, when they left. Izuku didn't know where he was going, he just went. He tuned out the sounds of the people and cars on the streets and instead put his earbuds in and started listening to some of his usual depressing music. After a while, Izuku's stomach protested at the lack of nutrition, and he looked around to see if there was any place he could get something to eat. There was a nice little coffee shop he spotted, so he headed there. Since it was later in the day, probably 5 p.m. now, there weren't many people there. Just Izuku, the 2 staff members at the service counter, and someone else who looked like a university student working on their laptop in the corner. Izuku got a sandwich and a black coffee. Hanging around Shoyuta for so long got him addicted to the stuff. He just sat down and ate his food slowly while listening to his wooden scar.
Probably.
Now the next challenge presented itself as he turned and faced the cat sitting in the doorway of the bathroom. They made eye contact, and she saw where he was going with this. Caramel, I need to properly clean your paws and claws, he said, and Caramel started backing up slowly. The next hour and a half was him chasing her around the apartment until finally he caught her and quickly rinsed her paws, to her dismay. Finally, Izuku started to once more feel the effects of exhaustion pulling him down, and he immediately crashed onto his bed. No dinner, no getting ready to sleep, not even changing into something more comfortable. He just slept in a Shoyuta-approved manner.